Okie dokie, guys and ladies. I've noticed another uptick in female viewers, which is awesome. I'm glad to have not only women, but also all of our male compatriots that always join us regularly and religiously. So, guys, we've been on probably the longest break we've ever done since we started the show. I needed a little bit of break, but also needed some time to start reading some good books for some great guests we've got coming up. And I've had this book for quite a bit, but it's a stout book because of so much history this man lived and participated in. And we're very honored today. We're going to be joined by a battalion recon man, a force recon man, and also a Rhodesia war veteran, Mr. John Cronin, or should I say Dr. John Cronin. And the book I'm mentioning is his book called The Bleed, and it is linked in the show notes, the Amazon link, and I recommend you get it. It is big, but he covers a lot of his personal history, but he also gives a great insight into how the war in Vietnam started, what the Marines were doing, and why they were in Vietnam. But also, he does a great, and that's why I spent so much time getting ready for this. He talks a lot about the internal struggles, politics, and what was going on in Rhodesia and what they were up against, not only in the field, but politically and socially. So, before I explain too much and bore everyone, let me hand it off to the good doctor today. And first off, thank you, Dr. Cronin, for joining us, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Bud. Uh, as a way of sort of introducing this subject, I think it would probably be best if I just covered how I got into the Marines, and Bud and I are going to have another conversation about Rhodesia in another broadcast. But I came from a military family. My father was an Army officer who was actually a POW in World War II. He got captured by the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge. He was a tank commander, captain, and spent 3 months in confinement before he escaped and made it to the Russian lines. So I had this sort of military history in my family. And I had a great uncle who was a retired Marine lieutenant general who commanded the Marines, 2nd Marine Division at the Battle of Tarawa in the Pacific in 1943. So the lineage was there. And when I was at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, I got bounced out on demerits. I was just the worst freshman or rat that school had ever had. And so this is in '66. And of course, if you're 19 and able-bodied, you were going one place, and that was in the armed forces. So instead of going into the Army, excuse me, for 2 years, I decided certainly that I was going to go to Vietnam. So I enlisted for 3 years in the Marine Corps. Not that the Army was a bad deal. I mean, there were some perfectly good people in there, but I figured if I were going to Vietnam, my chances might be a little better if I went with guys who were volunteering to go into the armed forces as opposed to guys who were just draftees and the Marines. I went through Paris Island, where Bud's father actually went through a year after I did, 2 years after I did, and he's got quite a story about his dad training, much the same as I did. They didn't change much of the events that you had to go through. And it was a 9-week course, and then I went out to San Diego for radio school. Spent 6 months learning Morse code, and then I went to Vietnam as a radio operator with 1st Recon Battalion. But I didn't last very long. It was 7.5 weeks, and I got hit in an ambush in a place called Antenna Valley, which was outside of Da Nang. Shot 3 times, twice in the right thigh and once in the stomach, that sort of exited right through my back. So they laid me up in the hospital in the Philippines and then Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland for about 6 months. And when I got out of that hospital, I decided, I hadn't really done my time in Vietnam. I sort of felt like I owed the Marines. And so I enlisted, or not enlisted, but I volunteered to go back. And that's when I went with 3rd Force Recon. And we were up in a place called Quang Tri in those days. And I ran 25 long-range reconnaissance patrols, most of them in the DMZ. And in October '68, I got hit. In fact, it was exactly the same day that I got hit the first time. I got hit the second time in another ambush where we whacked some North Vietnamese up at a place called Qua Viet. And Bud's father actually worked in the same area when he was in Vietnam. And took a grenade fragment in the shoulder. So that laid me up for a few weeks. And then I left the Marines after 3 years. So went to the Citadel in 1970 as a veteran student, and then finished my degree program in political science, and then went back in the Marines as an officer, infantry officer, and then I went to get my master's degree after I left the Marines in '76 at American University of Beirut, and then on to the University of London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And after I've been in Rhodesia before that. So as I said, we'll talk about that. Bud and I will talk about that in another broadcast. And so that's briefly how I ended up in the service, and sort of an overview of my 10 years on active duty. And Bud, I'll sort of hand that over to you from there.
Yes, sir. I'm getting some photos ready. And let me clear up one little misconception. Dad was actually at MCR, the recruit depot in San Diego. He did
was
not.
San Diego.
Sadly, he regrets that. He hated being Hollywood Marine. He wanted to be a chesty puller Marine on the island. That's his biggest faux pas, and hates that he was a Hollywood Marine, but he did it nonetheless. But yes, sir. Everything else, he was up in the Qua Viet with near your neck of the woods as well.
Let me tell you, when I was out of San Diego in training for 6 months, I used to see a lot of the recruits going through the drills in San Diego at MCRD. Those guys, I think, had it harder than we did at Parris Island, because they tried to wipe out that stupid nonsense about Hollywood Marine. And so your tail was in a grind if you ever went to San Diego as opposed to Parris Island. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. So, kudos to your dad for surviving that. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, they got them out here in their Ranger panties out here just pumping. I was curious because Dad, what little, like I said offline, he didn't share very much, but he did share some stories of boot camp. And you mentioned VMI. I mean, kind of we need to actually speak about that before we even get into the Marines, because guys, I don't know if y'all know the prestige of Virginia Military Institute, but was it started by a Union general, or was it a Confederate general that started VMI?
It was founded in 1839, and the first instructor there in military science was Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall.
And so they've named an arch after Stonewall Jackson. And the recruits, second, third, and first classmen there volunteered for battle at the Battle of New Market, and lost about 35 men facing Union forces as they swept down through the Shenandoah, and they stopped them dead in their tracks at this Battle of New Market. And so these boys, and they were 17, 18, 19 years old, are buried at VMI now. And there's quite a history behind that, their sort of contribution to the Civil War. And in retaliation, the Union forces came back through, 3 times as strong as 4, and burned VMI right to the ground. And so they had to rebuild that in '67, I think it was. And so that's where my dad and my brother and I went. They graduated. I, as I said, was a foul freshman there. And I just accumulated too many demerits, and they said, "Man, we don't need you anymore." So they bounced me right on out about 2 weeks before final exams in '66.
It's so interesting, and guys, if you do not have the book, it is, I get asked all the time about great recon books, or just great Vietnam books in general, or great books. This is an absolute amazing history book, personal stories book, and a lot of fun, to be honest, because he has a lot of fun in between his heroic acts in the field on both continents, or the two continents he fought on. But one of the funny things to get started, you kind of start off chapter one, you're kind of doing a Tarantino thing timeline where you're in Paris Island first, and then you're at VMI. But while we're talking about VMI, it's amazing because you mentioned your father graduated in 39, your brother 64, and their name was as good as gold. And if I'm not mistaken, the day or soon after you get off, you and a buddy are about to get hazed or getting hazed, and somebody asks your name and immediately realizes you're VMI royalty.
That took place at Paris Island. There was a classmate of mine, a brother rat of mine by the name of Randy Vass, who I was in summer school with down there. This is just before I got drafted, and he got bounced out the same time I did. And so I was at Paris Island, and I'd just gotten off the buses. It was about 2 a.m. We were just exhausted, and we were standing in line, and straight as arrows, and they were beating hell and whacking me a few times. And I look across this room, and I see this guy with a shaved head just like mine, and he gives me the dumbest look and smiles, and it's Randy Vass. So he enlisted also. And I made the mistake of laughing and sort of nodding my head at him. And of course, there were 3 DIs that just saw this, and they almost killed me. You just didn't do that when you were standing in ranks. It was the dumbest thing I had done up until that time in my life. But yeah, he went to Vietnam. I saw him afterwards, and he was with the infantry. I think he was with 5th Marines, like your dad, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
Not the same battalion, but I think he's with the 5th Marines over there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I thought I remember seeing that as well, which another thing that ties it in that's so neat. I was interested to see while we're still on VMI, your father's history, as you mentioned, and what all he went through. And he had a rough time, but he went through VMI, and he desperately wanted to prove himself to end up at West Point and graduate from West Point, and he ended up there. Did he, in fact, get to actually graduate, or was he called up at that point in time since he was a little bit older?
No, that's a good question. Actually, he was too young. He had applied to West Point, and he was only 17 at the time, and they weren't taking boys that age in those days. So the admissions officer said, "Look, apply a year from now at 18, and we'll get your senator, to recommend you," because he had pretty decent high school. He was from outside of Boston, in a area that in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So he decided he did not want to wait, and so he did enlist. Excuse me. He did get admission to VMI, and graduated when he was 20. And then he said, "Well, I'm old enough now, so I'm going to go back and try West Point again." So he did get admitted, and he spent a year up there. Caught holy hell, as you can imagine, from being a VMI graduate going up to West Point. And he said, "Hell, I don't need this anymore. I've been through 4 years of this nonsense. I do not need this." So he left after his first year up there, plebe year, and he had a degree in civil engineering, and he worked in the field in Chicago at the ironworks up there for a year before World War II broke out in 41, and that's when he got commissioned as a second lieutenant in the armored. So he commanded a tank platoon of M10s, and he was at the Battle of the Bulge, a place called St. Vith, when they got overrun by Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Division, hit him head on, and they just got rolled up. They were just, the lines were too thin. So he got captured and got marched across Poland, and was in a camp, a POW camp for American officers. And as the Russians were approaching, the Germans just panicked, and the guards were down. And so he and about 20 men escaped and started moving. They said, we're not going west, because that's where the German forces are going. They're running away from the Russians. So we're going to head into the Russian lines. The problem with that was that the fleeing Germans were coming head on to them. And so they had to evade these Germans for 2 weeks. And finally, they met these Russian forces. He was by himself by that time, because a couple of his people got killed by Germans. So he ended up getting picked up by the Russian forces, and they took him down to Odessa, which is in fact in the news a lot today with the war in Ukraine. And then he flew back on Eisenhower's personal plane. Eisenhower wasn't there, but they flew him back to London, and he took then a flight from London to Paris, and he rejoined his unit and was ready to go. The war was about over by then, so he decided he's going to go join the advance party to land in Japan, because that was gearing up in 45. And he was on a ship ready to be on the first wave going in with that when the bomb was dropped at Hiroshima. And so his ship just sort of continued on to the U.S., and then he landed in California, through San Francisco. And he was only 26 at the time. He was a captain. So he backed up a lot. He got hit also when he was just before he was captured. So there was that too. And he got hit in the leg. And so he had to march with this wound in his leg. And he said the only reason they lived was because it was so damn cold that the blood coagulated. If he said if it had been in a tropical climate, he would have died there. But the cold weather is what saved him.
Yeah, that's one of the more interesting parts. I mean, your book is so well loaded not only with your personal history, but history people need to know about conflicts. You go into great detail about your father, but the conflicts you participated in. And I was just so interested because I've recently been getting the Band of Brothers books, the Captain Spears biography, and some of the Marines from the Pacific. Forgetting the Sledgehammer, Eugene Sledge, who is from Auburn, right up the road from me. I found it very interesting. Two things actually from your father before we track down the line in your history. But as you said, I believe he immediately was married after Pearl Harbor, was working in the steel mill, commissioned, and began training on tank destroyers. But when he got into or was in training, he met up with a group of mobsters, or what he believed to be some wise guys that joined up and were rather pissed off.
Yeah, they were. These guys were from a Philadelphia Mafia family. Mm-hmm. And there were, I think, 3 brothers there and a couple of cousins and 1 or 2 close friends. And these guys were all made.
Oh yeah,
these were part of a family up there, and they didn't like what was happening in Italy. They didn't like the fact that Italy was allied with Germany at the time, and they didn't like this sort of fascist behavior. And so they joined the army, and they all joined together, and they joined on the condition that they would be assigned to the same unit. And they ended up in my dad's tank company. And he said that they were the toughest, meanest looking bunch you've ever seen. They were incredibly respectful. They, of course, being brought up in that environment, you can imagine they were used to obeying orders, and they could not have been more pleasant to him. And they were the best soldiers he ever saw. But he said nobody came close ever to crossing any one of these guys, because it's not that they advertised they were tough guys, but everybody sort of knew that these guys were wise guys, and you just weren't gonna cross them. But he said they were just first class soldiers when they got into combat in Germany. They functioned really well. They were all assigned to 2 tanks that worked together. So he said that they're 2 of the best tanks he had in his whole company.
See, that's why I love talking to you guys in this period of time, because family members, and as I told you, I'm glad you mentioned family, because it would come up about your family history. And a lot of guys don't know it, and I don't advertise it, but I'm a bit of a organized crime fan. I'm a big fan of the Chicago Mafia, the outfit as it was known. It's not around anymore, although they say it is. The 5 families in New York, but Philly is the redheaded stepchild of organized crime. But people would be very, very surprised at the actual, as you just said, the made button men that participated and took up arms to fight for America, even though they hated the government. They were not going to have people killing Americans and doing that.
But isn't it true that Bugsy Siegel helped clear up traffic in the New York Port Authority and refused to allow any unions to strike during World War II because he wanted to make sure that American weapons and armament and men got clear passage over to Germany? So he ran the ports up there and made sure that the unions behaved themselves. Is that correct?
Naval intelligence got too lucky because Lucky Luciano, who ran the
eventual right.
Genovese family, and he was in prison at the time for prostitution. But Meyer Lansky, his number two, the Jewish fellow with Ben as his second in command, he put out word to protect the docks at all costs, and that's what got Lucky sprung from prison. Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Meyer Lansky and Ben Siegel protected the docks vehemently. Absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
Strange thing here that my little interest in mob history and your father getting to serve with some button men and from Philly is a funny story. Did they happen to make it through the war? Did you know? Or
they did. A couple of them got hit. You get fried up pretty quickly in a tank when you get hit with those. They were shoulder fired
Panzerfaust.
What were they called?
The Panzerfaust?
Yes, Panzerfaust, exactly. And two of them got burned pretty badly in one tank, but they all survived. They came back from the war together, and a couple of them they went to reunions too after the war. They went to reunions for about 15, 20 years. So he'd see him at every one of these reunions. Of course, they'd always sit together. Very polite, but sort of insular. Interesting history there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that as well.
Sure.
And another interesting thing, because if I'm not mistaken, this happened in one of the great new tank movies that just came out. And it's, super Hollywood, but it's a great Hollywood war movie, Fury, if I'm not mistaken. Your father, when he was captured, I believe, much like in Fury or one of the movies, they had Americans that were Germans dressed up as Americans who were American educated or had been in America. And was he captured by one of those Germans dressed up as an American?
When he was captured, he was brought into an interrogation unit, and the fella who interrogated him was a German major who had grown up in the same town as he. He was a little older, a couple of years older, 3 or 4 years older. They ended up having gone to the same high school in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And this guy spoke English better than you and I. And he was, of course, very, very approachable. You can imagine, when you're interrogating a guy, you want to be on his best side, cigarettes, coffee, food, that sort of thing. But he couldn't understand why my dad liked the Red Wings, Detroit Red Wings, instead of the Boston Bruins. And he said, that's just odd. Who comes from Boston and doesn't support the Red Sox or the Bruins? What is wrong with you? And so they sort of had a little laugh about that. But the guy was very, very polite, and you get name, rank, and serial number, and he knew he wasn't getting much beyond that. So he went through about an hour of that, and then they put him into this transit camp and started marching him across Poland. But the interrogation officers were absolutely first-class intelligence pros. First class. They knew. Of course, the key in that sort of environment is you never ask a question that you don't know the answer to already. And what you're asking for is confirmation of information that you have, or stuff that you think is good intelligence, and you just need confirmation of that. And once that's done, then you go out and you start reaching for things you don't know about. But the first thing you do is establish what you already know. And so he knew my dad's battalion. He knew his division, his regiment. He knew his company without even asking. They were extremely well informed. The German intelligence, they made their mistakes, to be sure, but certainly on the lower levels, company grade levels, these guys were absolutely first class pros.
Man, oh man, that it's I love WW2 history, and I'm just amazed at how close it came. I mean, here if a few things didn't go the
Yeah,
opposite way, we might be speaking German over here right now.
you might be right too.
Um, I so we've kind of we're moving along here to where you're getting into boot camp. You're getting the full on. You're on the Greyhound. You already hear the DIs long before the bus even shuts down, and they immediately go up and down the line, just berating the bejesus out of y'all, and off to shave heads, and all of the whole 9 yards. And y'all immediately have a mess up, which inevitably happens because Dad told me the same thing. He had moles on his head. Can you talk a little bit about what the first fairly big issue you ran into on a haircut issue?
The first thing they did to you when you got in was shave your head. And these barbers were methodically dangerous people. Uh, and you had to tell them if you had a mole anywhere on in the hairline. And if you didn't, they would rake your head just like a lawnmower. And they were absolutely merciless. And this, we ended up standing in line, nose to the back of the head kind of line. And this kid in front of me had not told the barber that he'd had a mole. And of course, the barber clipped it off. He was bleeding as though he'd been hit by a grenade up there, all down the back of his head. And this DI came up and sort of pushed us aside very, very gently and said, look, son, you're here to take orders. You're here to learn how to obey orders. We asked you, and he said this very, very quietly. He said, if you can't follow a simple order about telling a barber about a mole on your head, how do you think you're going to last in combat when the stress is high and you have to obey orders and you can't ask questions? How do you think you're going to survive Vietnam? And the guy, and so then he said, well, I didn't get a straight answer for it. So he slapped him stupid right there. He said, now I'm going to ask you again. So he asked the same question. Well, I'll start listening up, sure, blah, blah, blah. But they had to take him out of line and sew his head up. The bleeding was so bad. And that's essentially how DIs treated you in those days. As I said earlier, they don't touch you now. But in the 60s, as through World War II and Korea and so on, they wouldn't hesitate to level you and knock you right on the floor. And corporal punishment there was rampant and severe. And they didn't hesitate, and nobody asked questions. And you knew you were going to get tanked if you didn't step up and do what you were told. It was just clear as hell. So you had to listen to what you were told.
Oh yeah. And I think I've got some photos as we make our way to it, because I think you speak about it as well. But my father was at the pugilist, the bayonet, the fake bayonet course, where they're in football helmets and knocking heads loose.
Oh, yeah.
And all of that. And the guys weren't evidently going hard enough and cutting the mustard, so to speak, and the DI was absolutely livid, I mean, yelling about to bust a blood vessel, and got in there and took both of them on, knocked their heads loose, and said, somebody jump in here right now and let me show you how to correctly do this. And everybody immediately said no, but there was this one guy that still thought he was a bad cookie. And he walked in there and was laughing and was going to take his head off. And that DI swept his feet out from under him and just crammed that thing on top of his face. And they had to take him immediately to med. And Dad had numerous times where he's like, the DIs were like, I'll take my Smokey Bear off. I'll take my rank and all of that off, step in the back, and I will fight you right now. And nobody was dumb enough to take him up on that offer.
Yeah, those Pugil sticks were mean. If you throw that picture up again, you'll see of course they're padded on both ends, but what they do is they will pair you off by weight. They would never put a heavyweight in with a lightweight. They'd always be sort of kind enough, if you will, to match guys up. They didn't care about the height, but this certainly was the weight, kind of like boxing. And if you ever wanted to get your brains scrambled, this was the best way that I could possibly think of. And what they were curious about is not whether you won or lost, but if you would just step up and get in there and just fight. They didn't want guys that backed down. They didn't want guys that were reluctant or hesitated. They wanted you to go in there and start swinging. And if you got beaten, fine. They'd stop it right there. If they knew you were down and you were sort of defenseless, and they'd pull you out, and they would then pair up two more guys. But they just wanted to see you take care of yourself and make an attempt to take care of yourself. And that was the whole point of that exercise.
Show some heart. Oh, let's see here. And I'm always curious as we get down to it as well. Not only about the y'all qualifying, but I'm always interested in the initial batch of shots. And I've got my dad's. This isn't my father, by the way. I do have some photos of my father. I'll show y'all because y'all do ask about my father. But are these the old shotguns that y'all all have to line up?
Yeah, we got a series of shots when we arrived. Now that gun actually injects 5 different serums into you at the same time. One is for typhoid, one is malaria, a couple others. And then you got those at Paris Island or San Diego, and then you would get them again once you hit the Philippines or Okinawa on your way to Vietnam. Then they would give you plague shots because rat bites, were pretty serious. They'd give you another malaria, and they'd give you 4 or 5 more. And when you walked out of that, you were lucky if your arm could move for the next week or so. It was just unbelievably painful. But that saved having to get separate injections. So you lined up, as you can see this guy in the photograph there, head to tail, and bang, he would just flip the switch, and it'd be another 6 shots, and another 6, and another 6, and another 6. And we did that actually twice when we were in the Philippines, or Okinawa, excuse me, waiting to go to Vietnam. And it was sort of it's almost like mass suicide. When you stepped into that, because you never knew if you're going to pass out or not. And some guys did. They just didn't like needles. And these were air guns that forced these things in your skin, but that didn't matter to them. You put anything on their arm, and these guys would get weak at the knees, and bang, out they'd go.
I gotta admit, I'm no fan of needles, but as long as it was in a gun and I'm not looking at it, I could probably take it. But I'm no fan of needles as well. By your observation, when you did get in country, do you think all of the stuff y'all got, did it work pretty well? I mean, of course, pertaining not to drinking dirty water, just being reckless, but did it work pretty well for y'all?
Yeah. You mentioned as we were certainly preparing for this about guys that got bitten by rats, and it was very, very common to get bitten by a rat, particularly near base camps, but you get bitten by bush rats too, and they carried the plague, and that killed something like that killed a couple of hundred men in Vietnam over the course of that war, where they got bitten, and for some reason those shots didn't work. But that big one that you got was a plague shot, and we also had to take malaria pills once we were in country. And we were up in the mountains. We were up in the DMZ, so we had to take actually 2 kinds of malaria pills that you didn't have down south, because there were 2 different types of mosquitoes up there that could give you 2 different types of malaria. And one was this small pill about the size of an aspirin, and the other was an orange that was about the size of a silver dollar. This is the biggest damn thing I've ever seen. And so you were given those, if you were back from the bush, you were given those every, I think it was Monday morning. And the corpsmen would come by, and they would make sure you didn't spit these things out, because you didn't want malaria. That was a terrible, terrible thing, because that stays with you for half your life. So they'd make you swallow the small one, and then they would make you take this big one, and they'd come by and they'd check you with a flashlight to make sure you wouldn't hide it under your tongue. And there were some guys that still tossed these things away afterwards. I thought that was idiotic behavior, but I always took my malaria pills, and I got bitten by 2 trillion mosquitoes over there, and I never had a problem. You just do, you do the basic stuff and take care of yourself. It's not that hard.
You do come, I think, in Vietnam, but especially as we'll get into next week in Rhodesia, you do come in contact with some bad bugs, and that's it took you a while to get over those. We'll be talking about that.
Mhm.
And we've got a few Vietnam vets that are getting me questions, SOG vets that are wanting to ask about the differences of Rhodesia. So I know the Rhodesia cast, people are already talking about. They're excited for that as well.
Good.
But while we're still at Paris Island, I have 1 or 2 more things that I thought needed to be at least spoken about, guys, because there's just so much. We'd be on here for 3 hours today covering all of the stuff in the book. You need to get the book, but we're going to cover some good stuff nonetheless. I found it interesting, much like you said, having old heads around. That's not demeaning. I mean that as a term of endearment, the old heads in the group. You had a gunny that was at the from Korea during the Chosen Reservoir. I think your DIs, I should say. Another one was a NCO that had a Bronze Star with Valor during Vietnam. I believe I may be mixing it up. I thought maybe both were injured at some point in time, or maybe one of them had a Purple Heart. Let's see. Then I made 2 more notes on this. What was I found it interesting in the book. What was the word of the day, the little exercise that Rasputin went through?
Rasputin stood about a 1.5 feet tall. He was he just made the minimum height requirement, which I think was 4'11" in those days, and he couldn't have been 4'11" and 1 millimeter tall. And he came in with a name like Splachtukstuvaskovich or something weird like that, and nobody could pronounce that. So the DIs just ended up calling Rasputin. And every morning before we went down to breakfast, we'd have stand up. There were 80 of us in the platoon, and this is, of course, at Paris Island. And the DI would say, "Rasputin, you little commie F, what's a good word for the day?" And Rasputin would step forward 2 steps and say, "Sir, the day is, I'm Rasputin, and I'm a badass, and I'm going to kick your little mother effing ass, and you cross me, and you have just eaten a big pile of you-know-what." And he'd get back into ranks, and the DI would say, "You're effing A right, boy. Let's march, and let's have the rest of the day." And Rasputin would come out and give the word of the day. And that's what he did for nine straight weeks. Those DIs were funny. They were a funny bunch. You always had a senior DI who was a senior NCO, like a gunnery sergeant, or mostly gunnery sergeants. This guy was as you said, a Chosen Reservoir vet from Korea. Been wounded twice over there. He had frostbite and lost 2 of his fingers from his left hand. They were amputated. We had 2 sergeants who were the junior DIs. Both of these guys were combat vets, and both had been hit in Vietnam. One, as I said, had a Bronze Star. And oddly enough, I saw one of those DIs in Vietnam 2 years later. He was with Battalion Recon when I was with Force, and we were standing at the same mail chute one day. And I said, and he was a staff sergeant by then. I said, "Sergeant Greer, Staff Sergeant Greer, were you at PI?" And he said, "Oh yeah. He didn't remember me, but I said, "Well, you were my DI there." He said, "Oh man, don't punch me, Al. Don't come after me." I said, "No, you were actually decent. You only whacked me about 3 or 4 times, as opposed to Sergeant Gray, who used to floor me about once a week." So, anyway,
yeah.
Marine Corps was so small that that you always saw people that you had seen years before. You'd rotate into these units, and these guys were there. It was just, I probably saw half a dozen guys from Vietnam that I saw 10 years later in '76 when I was commissioned. Just routinely, standing in line or in ranks or pay or whatever.
That's that. I love that. The small community that combat vets are, and especially the small group that Marines are. That I learned that very well from my father. He said you could go in a bar, and if you ever needed help anywhere, you could say, "Are there any fellow Marines in here?" And one or two people in a bar full would raise their hand, and they'd go to war with you immediately, just for the
Sure,
fact you are a fellow Marine. That's
sure.
what I love about the Marine Corps. I mean, the brotherhood. Um, you y'all actually do you're going through your PTs, you're doing hand to hand like we kind of just showed. You're doing the pugilistics. Y'all actually get a NATO exercise. Um, and then I believe right before graduation, we have another incident that pops up. Do you it Yeah, I believe yes, it was you that had your you were cleaning your rifle and there happened to be a dadgum spider in it.
Oh man, we had M14s back in the day, and and I went out for rifle inspection. And the last thing you do before you go out there is you put a bore brush down through the bore and bring it up, and you look down there, and that's. So I get out in ranks, and hell, in the time it took me to get from my bunk to outside, which was like 3 minutes, some stupid ass little spider had crawled into the receiver and was at the base of the bore. And the DI comes and sees this and said, "Oh my God, you got an NVA spider in your bore. Look at this. Take a look at this, you little moron." And I look at it, and by the time I see it, this thing has then disappeared. It's gone out. It's disappeared. And he said, "You let an NVA spider loose on my base? Are you kidding me?" And he took that 14 and whacked me with a stock right along the side of my head and knocked me absolutely cold, absolutely flat on my ass cold. Um, and it took me probably 4 or 5 minutes to regain consciousness. I get up on my hands and knees and I struggle it up. And he waits the whole time while I'm fishing around for a foothold. And he comes up and he said, "Look, you got hit pretty hard, but this is not the hardest you're ever going to get hit the rest of your life. So you need to remember this. You need to take care of your equipment because when you don't, it really pisses me off. And so you just remember this." I said, "Oh, Jesus, sir, I promise, Private promises you he will remember." So I'd never let a spider into my bore again. Thank you very much.
That's one thing with the Marines, boy. They I mean, till the day my dad died, even with cancer, I mean, he could field strip any dadgum weapon I put in front of him. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, they taught y'all quite well. I mean, the Marines are in a class of their own. I love the Army and the Special Forces, but a gung ho recon Marine or a grunt is, I mean, you can take the world with them. Let's see. So you are now another, as we're closing out for boot camp. Another fantastic story pops up. You're graduating, I believe, December 23rd of '66.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you've got your orders as an RTO. You're going to be off to Camp Geiger, I think. But for graduation, your great uncle Julius C. Smith is coming, and who is a Navy Cross awardee. He earned, I should say, the Navy Cross at Tarawa. And the DI is utterly flabbergasted and shocked that the private has this type of lineage in his blood and thinks you're actually pulling his leg.
Oh yeah, the last question they asked you before the night before, or I guess it was a week before graduation, is does anyone here have any VIPs coming down? Now most of these boys are country boys. They came from some pretty rough backgrounds, and so none of these guys raised their hands. And I thought, well, hell, all right. So I raised my hand, and this DI almost fell off his stool. And he said, "Cronin, who would a maggot like you know who has anything to do with anything?" I said, "Well, private has a great uncle who's a retired lieutenant general who took the 2nd Marine Division in at Tarawa. he said, somebody bring me a 14. I'm going to shoot this SOB, because he didn't believe me. But it turned out that not only was I'm sorry, not only was he I'm sorry about that. Not only was he a there he is. There's a Navy Cross. You got that at Tarawa. He came down and he was when he was a division commander, when he had 2 stars. In fact, that's when he had 2 stars there as a major general. The DI there, the DI had known him. He had enlisted, this DI, the senior DI in 46, and had known him and been under his command at the 2nd Marine Division. But more sort of weirdly, the base commander was a major general who had been a company commander of his at Tarawa. And so they knew one another. Of course, he was a lieutenant, as a major general. He didn't really know he didn't know company grade officers, by name, but this guy knew him. And so I go over to his house after graduation, and this guy's this major general. They got staff officers and senior, commanders there. And I'm this dumb little nothing private standing there in a corner. And my uncle is hashing it up with all these retired and active duty, colonels and generals and so on. I never felt so out of place in my mind. But those guys knew one another, and they had a really, really good ripping time there at the, he retired in 48, right after the war. He enlisted, not enlisted, but he got commissioned in 1909. So he was one of the old Corps types.
Born September 11th, 1885. Died a day before my birthday, November 5th, 1975. Of course, I wasn't born in 75. Age 90. United States Marine Corps, 1909 to 1946. He was a 3-star lieutenant general. 2nd Marine Division, MCRD, Paris Island, Department of the Pacific. He was in the Banana Wars on Veracruz and Nicaragua with Chesty Puller, WW1, WW2, Tarawa, and Peleliu, Navy Cross, and the Distinguished Service Medal twice. My God in heavens.
Yeah, he was a good guy. I was the only other Marine in the family. And I had a whole list of Army veterans, Navy veterans, and Air Force veterans who were part of my family. And but he was the only Marine. And then, as it turned out, I was the only other Marine. And so he didn't have any children. He sort of always looked at me like his son. And when I got hit, the commandant of the Marine Corps had found out about this. And I was in the hospital at the Philippines, and the commandant of the Marine Corps writes him, because one of his staff officers come across my name. He never reached out. He never asked anybody for anything. But this guy, the commandant, reached out to him and said, we understand that your nephew got whacked in, Tam Kee province, and we're keeping an eye on him. So he wrote him a couple of letters on my medical status, while I was hospitalized in the Philippines. Now I've still got those letters. But that's how far and that's how tightly knit the Marines were. This guy served. They actually served together in World War II. So, I mean, these friendships go back, they go back for 40, 50 years.
And that's what I'm talking about with the Marines. I mean, it literally is a brotherhood built in blood, disaster, and builds the ultimate bond of camaraderie ship for life. I mean, because like you just said, the general or the commandant, which I think was a general at that time, says, I'll keep you updated. He starts off saying he's not in serious condition, which means he put in doctor's terms, and then put for layman, he's out of the worst of it. Looks like he's going to fully recover. But if anything comes up, we'll let you know immediately, but we'll be in touch. I mean, this is the commandant of the Marine Corps talking about a young. Were you a sergeant at this time already, or still
I was
private?
I was just a lance jack. in those days. I was an E2, I was a nothing. I was just a nothing radio operator. That's all. 19-year-old, 19, 20-year-old, nothing.
Oh my God. And that's what we're going to get into. And I wish I had some of your graduation photos, but I mean, think of how y'all came out of Marine Corps. This is my dad. They're in their final exams doing their pull-ups, and I've got his graduation photo right here I wanted to show, but there's nothing. The Marines have such a influence on recruiting and why they don't struggle with recruiting because of the uniforms and the class of people that they're wanting. My father's right here at the very top, big, thick-necked and peeled head. I mean, nothing looks better, in my opinion, than a Marine in his his dress blues or what have you. That is the picture of perfection, military wise, in my opinion.
Yeah, the Marines used to call their dress blues the lay machine because I won't go into detail on that, but that's pretty easy to figure out there.
No problem with the ladies.
Yeah.
I love that, and it wasn't. I did see a Marine in dress blues with that blood stripe and his fruit salad up there. Ain't nothing like that for drawing some ladies into the mix. So as I mentioned, you had just graduated, and we're getting to San Diego, and I believe it's 1967 at this point in time, and you're at Camp Geiger for individual training regiment, I believe, for crew weapons, squad work, mortars, and the such. But also, I believe you also get into your RTO / Morse code school at this point in time.
Yeah, the Geiger was everybody went to that. That was a month of training after you finished Parris Island, and I think even the San Diego Marines went through Geiger, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe they went out to Pendleton. I think they went out to Pendleton for their month. But we did the crew serve weapons and mortars and 3.5 rocket launchers and so on, and then from there you go into your MOS training. If you were infantry, you'd go through a couple of months of advanced infantry training. I was a radio operator, so I went to San Diego for the 6 months. And that was a very uneventful 6 months. It was just, we worked on Morse code day in, day out. And after that, I was 14 words a minute, maybe receive, I think it was about 18 words a minute. And that was it, 6 months. And so I finished in June of 67, right after the June Day War in the Middle East, as a matter of fact. And then got orders for Vietnam. And so I went to California for another month of jungle warfare school. And then in August of 67, I got to Vietnam and went with the 1st Recon Battalion.
I've always been curious because Dad, again, simple grunt, went in as a simple grunt, came out as a simple grunt. But he said, other than being, and I don't know how much you'll attest to this, but they are essentially brainwashing y'all and getting y'all ready and gung ho and ready to lay siege down. But he did not feel the average grunt did not have enough time training and was not ready to go in for what they were going in. Guys adapted and learned and picked up, but how did you feel about your training and then your that last bit of jungle training at Camp Pendleton? How do you feel?
Well, the radio training was perfect. I mean, I had no problems in sending and receiving Morse code, or they call it CW, or continuous wave. The combat training, they try to make it as realistic as possible. They have nothing but Vietnam vets that designed the training courses at Pendleton and so on. They march you through jungle lanes. They show you how to disarm a mine. Of course, you'd never do that. The combat engineers would do that. They show you anti-ambush drills, point-to-point contacts, peel-offs, how to set up a night ambush, how to break contact. I mean, they show you what to do in the event this all happens, but they can only go so far Now, the jungle training got better as the war went on because, of course, the NVA and VC refined their tactics. So we did also and refined our training. But in the early stages of the war, Marines had only been over there for 2 years when I got there, and the Vietnamese were slowly evolving and becoming better and better. In fact, when the war broke out and the Marines went over there in '65, the VC, not the NVA, because the NVA weren't particularly involved at that stage, but the main force VC units were working in company and battalion size units. And then they got mixed up with the Marines, Operation Starlight and Hastings, and the Marines just wiped the floor with them, killed thousands of these people. And they figured, we're not going toe to toe with these Marine battalions. So that's when they started breaking down their units and started going out in platoon and even squad size formations, making it a lot harder for us to find them. And so that was incorporated into our training too. So by the time I got there, they were working in much smaller groups, as opposed to the company and battalion size organizations that they had in the early stages of the war, because they couldn't go toe to toe with us on the big unit. But small units, wow, a lot of these guys were French Indochina veterans from fighting French forces during the Indochina War, and so these guys were old soldiers, and they knew their business, and that's how they beat the French. They beat them in small unit tactics. And the reason why they went into battalion size units and company size units at the beginning of the war is beyond me. Nobody ever really knows that, but they thought they could beat us at that level, and they found out otherwise very, very quickly. So then they started reducing the size of their forces as the war went on, so that by the end of the war, they were working in just squad and platoon size, and not even platoon size, because that's where their success was. They were absolutely superb jungle fighters. It's just superb. We were never as good as they were. If we got into a fight with them on an even level, man to man and unit to unit, we could take them. But those guys just were so good in the jungle that it was absolutely scary. So no matter how well you trained, you weren't going to be as good as they were out there. You just weren't. And that's what we had to factor. Yeah, that's what we had to factor in when we trained. If we in small teams engage them in small teams, we could hold our own easily. Company to company, battalion to battalion, we could hold our own. But when they worked in those small units, they were just deadly, really, absolutely lethal.
Yeah, I mean, you're in their backyard, their home, so
Sure.
it's tough workings. And so as you're getting into Vietnam, you did one chapter, I think maybe, rather large chapter, goes into some great history that I recommend people, when they do buy this book, or if they have this book, go back and reread, because the good doctor goes through what Vietnam is going through previously and what they're going through at this moment and what will end up happening. He gets into DM having issues as far back as 55, abolishing elections. Of course, he's got the evil Alan Dulles talking about the domino theory and his evils that he did, Truman and Eisenhower's work. Of course, the coup in 63 that goes haywire, that brings in Van Tu and Air Marshal Cal Kai. It goes downhill progressively. But he does mention some bright spots, because he mentions the Marine CAP program, which is a fantastic program that was run. And several Marines actually went over to SOG that I know. One very famous is Captain Gary Robb, who had some extensive battles around Khe Sanh, and as a matter of fact was in some of the early hill fights with them. He mentions Abrams, the pacification of hamlets, William Colby, and the Hamlet program. And Colby was station chief. He'd go on, of course, to run the CIA. He mentions the great General Lew Walt trying to step in and get things running, which inevitably does start picking up. But if I'm not mistaken, now that we're in Vietnam now, I believe you said you are now at Chu Lai with 1st Mardiv as Task Force Oregon's going on, and you are trying to you get in as guys are getting back from R&R. Are you already with Battalion at this point, first Recon as the radio operator, or where are you at this point in
Yeah,
time?
when I arrived in Vietnam, you go to a staging area in Da Nang. Everybody goes through there, and there's this huge Butler building, and they would ask a very interesting development that took place. There was a guy seated on a stage behind a desk, and there might have been 200 or 300 of us in this sort of auditorium, and he would say, "All right, I've got 10 quotas for 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, 2-1. Do I have any 0311s, infantrymen or mortarmen that want to go with that?" And so some of these guys would raise their hands and whatnot. Well, it finally came. He said, "I've got one billet for a radio operator for 1st Recon." I thought, "Oh hell, I'll give it a shot. Why not? I don't know first thing about it, but why not?" So I raised my hand, and I got on a plane and flew down to Chile that afternoon. And I was in a team. I sat behind a couple of radio banks before for about a week, and I thought, Jesus, man, this is the most boring stuff I've ever been through. So I volunteered for a team, and of course, they'll pick you up right away. They needed radio operators, so I got assigned to a team about a week after I arrived, and I started running patrols. 3 days later, and had a very unfortunate experience because we had an extremely inexperienced platoon commander who had come over from the MPs. He was a first lieutenant, and he had no business in recon. He had no business leading the recon team, and he made some substantial mistakes that cost him his life eventually. But that's how I ended up in recon. You volunteer for it. Nobody assigns you. That's an all volunteer unit.
And I mean, let's see, as you get over to Delta company, I believe the first person you meet is, you see Sergeant Banks, but I think you see Skip Stomp, I think you're going to be on his team. And I think you are actually slated to go on a mission in the morning with him as soon as you get there.
That's right. I arrived I got to the team on an afternoon, late afternoon, and they put me right in as a radio operator, and I went out. We had a briefing that afternoon, and I was out the next day, first patrol. And we went up to this place called Hill 475, which was outside of Chulai, about 10 Ks west. And this platoon commander ours put us on a bald hill. I have no idea why he'd do this. It just was inexperience that the guy had. You don't walk around on a bald hill. For God's sakes, everybody it sort of overlooked in a valley, and everybody and his brother could see you walking. Even if you crawled, you were still, there was a lack of vegetation up there. You had no business being on top of this place. Not only that, but that team he had taken up there 2 weeks before, and they'd gotten hit. They got overrun, had lost a machine gunner killed, had a machine gun, an M60 captured by the NVA. And this guy wants to go right back up there. And Jesus, people were saying, holy moly, man, give it a chance to cool down and put us on a hill across the valley where you've got some vegetation. But no, he was too hard-headed for that. And he wanted to go right back up there. And he insisted on it. And so Battalion said, all right, we'll give you a shot. So we went up there, and we called in a lot of artillery for 3 days, a lot of NVA walking through that valley, and then they were they were moving south and then turning left towards the coast as they were infiltrating towards the coastal areas, which is what they were attacking in those days. And we lasted for 3 days before they found us, and then they hit us. They hit us on the fourth morning in force. There were 18 of us up on that hill, and we got overrun in one place. This is the first time I'd ever been in the bush. We had tripwires set up, and they're called mouse traps, which are these little explosive devices about the size of a matchbox, and they were wire loaded. So if you hit the tripwire, you'd pull this little pin, and the top would flip open on this matchbox, and then an explosive device would take place. So it was an early warning device. So you'd string this little wire across a trail, and tie the matchbox to the side of a tree, or the mousetrap to the tree. And as good as they were in infiltrating, and these guys were superb, one of their sappers tripped it by mistake, and it popped. And that tells you there's somebody out there that wants to pay you a visit. And as soon as they did that, they tripped. They knew they were had, so they got up and rushed, and they tripped another flare, which lit up the side of the hill. And I looked up, and all I saw were these NVA coming at us. They were side by side. There must have been 20 or 30 of them in a line, rushing us and screaming, I kill, a Marine, you die. And they came right at us. Most of them had no helmets and packs, but they were firing from the hip, and they were just swinging these AKs back and forth very methodically. These guys were veterans. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they figured we were a small team, maybe 15 men or so, which was exactly right. And they had about 3 times that number out there on our perimeter. And they came at us in 3 waves. And the first wave went down because the guys in the line just opened up. We had 2 M60s there, and they just cut these guys down. And then the second wave came in after them, and then the third wave after them. And they made it as far. They actually overran one of our positions. They got inside the perimeter. And there was hand-to-hand going on there. It scared the living hell out of me. I looked to my right, and I see all of this motion and stuff. But the guy I was with was a 2-time Vietnam vet. He said, you keep your head down, and you just fire and blow the claymores. And so that's what I did. I had two claymores out in front. Well, one of them got a grenade off and threw it right into the middle of the CP and hit our lieutenant. He took a frag right through the back of the head, went through the mastoid, and he went into this sort of locked position right there and just rolled up on his back and came into a locked position. And we got out of there. We had about 4 or 5 guys who were really badly hit, but we didn't lose any killed, which is a miracle. But the 46s came in and they medevaced us, and this lieutenant had all these bandages. This is where this corpsman you were talking about, Skip Stomp, sort of took care of him and wrapped him up. But he was bleeding so much from the head that the blood was running back and forth in the floorboards on the 46 right at my feet. And he went to 1st Med Battalion, and he died the next afternoon. And so we had a staff sergeant take over from him. But that was my first patrol. So you might say I had a little experience with what the bush was like, and seeing these guys come at us. They were only 15, 20 feet away. You could just see them. And they didn't even look pissed at us. They just looked like, this is our job, and we're going to whack you, Marines. But they didn't look angry. They looked like they were going to church or the temple. Sunday afternoon stroll. It was about 4 a.m. when they hit us. They always hit you at last light or first light, never during the midday, but they'd come at you as the light was fading or just before it came up.
I mean, this comment takes it all. Yeah, this is crazy. That's another thing we hear from Force and a lot of SOG men, especially, about the NVA screaming, Americans, you die now. Give up, you die now. And he just ordered your book, and it'll be in his doorstep Friday. You're going to enjoy it, my man. You'll enjoy it. Hearing the NBA scream with no doubts and shiver.
Yeah, it's right. It would straighten you right up, believe me. I didn't mention the fact that when they would go into a charge, into an assault, these guys would blow bugles, and they had a bugle that you could hear, and that was a sign for these guys to get up on line and hit you. Jesus Christ, that's the scariest thing I ever saw. I was, 19 years old. I'd never seen anything like this before. And hearing this bugle out in the middle of nowhere and seeing this whole line of people stand up not 30 feet from us. How they got that close to us, I don't know, because we were on 100% alert, 100%. And they got that close without being detected. 45 of them, 50, whatever it was. There were like 40, I think about 45 of them. And they were absolute masters at moving through the bush without making these sounds. But one of them, as I said, one of those sappers hit that tripwire, and then the game was on. They were astonishingly good. That's what made them so damn scary.
Another thing that makes them so scary, before that, to tie in two parts of this battle and what you went through is your first time out, and some of the guys were jealous when you got back, saying this is bull crap. You saw this on your first time out, and actually jealous that you went through this. You had NVA in the front of you. You immediately saw several dozen NVA stand up in front of you, hitting flares, say, "You die now, American." And Lurch says, "Blow claymores, blow them now." And y'all already have crossfire on y'all. And then all of a sudden, nothing. Utter silence, nothing, and no bodies. Y'all look for bodies. And I think Puff may have actually been on station for a while, but no bodies. Could you speak to that? How scary that is about how good they were about moving and getting bodies?
Yeah, they were when they first hit us. I was with this veteran by the name of Lurch. I've got his name in the book. It's since escaped me, but he was the one who said, just we straighten the pins on your grenades so you can pull the pins right at them and toss these things. You don't want to have to be straightening pins out in the middle of a contact. So you straighten the pins out, you put them on a little ledge in front of you. I had about 6 of them there. I had the 2 hell boxes for the claymores, and he said at one point, he said, all right, very calmly, he said, just blow the claymores, blow them now. So bam, bam, and those things are incredibly loud, and all you see is the smoke and dust in front of you. And there were people involved in that. I mean, you could see people being hit with these claymores. They're about the size of think of a couple of cartons of cigarettes on top of one another. They're about 500 ball bearings, packed in C4, and there's a blasting cap put in the top of it. There's a wire that runs back from the blasting cap to the hell box. You hit this hell box, it sends an electrical charge through the wire, blows the blasting cap, which blows the claymore out in like a half moon pattern in front of you. They're unbelievably deadly. And I hit 2 of those side by side, so it cleared out the whole area in front of me. And Lurch was throwing grenades. And as we were taking contact, the main radio operator, I was a secondary radio operator because I was so new, the main radio operator had called Puff in, which was a C-47 with a 105 millimeter cannon, an artillery piece, punched through the side of the fuselage. And so the pilot would dip his wings to the left, and he would circle around an area with his left wing down. And this cannon would fire over the wing itself onto the ground. They also had these miniguns, 7.62 miniguns, which fired several thousand rounds a minute. And these are Gatling guns. And there were, I think, 4 or 5 of those. Plus they had a 20 millimeter cannon. It was a gunship. It was nothing but, there you go. Exactly. There you go. Those are the right there that you see where the flames are coming out from. Those are the miniguns that are firing right there. And there's a cannon that goes over the wing, right? And those are tracers. So every 5th round was a tracer. And then you had the whole plane was loaded with, chopped to the gills with ammunition. And you had, I think, 5 loaders, a pilot and co-pilot. So here he is with his left wing dipped, and he'd fly around the contact area in a circle as those miniguns were firing on the ground. And they had so much ammunition, so much coming in and hitting the ground that the theory was that one round would hit every square yard on the ground. One round, every square yard. You wouldn't survive. If you were on the ground, you wouldn't survive something like that. And he worked out for about 15 minutes all around our position. And the reason I say I know we killed at least 15 or so is because when the contact was over, and I remember what you're saying was correct, it was absolute silence. And it happened immediately. First all this firing and then nothing. And they were gone. They pulled, what in fact they'd done is they pulled all their bodies, because they never wanted you to know how many of them you killed. That would give you an edge, and it would reveal that they were taking losses. So they always took the bodies if they could, and they would bury them in these slit trenches, which were about 3 feet deep. and they'd cover them with air, and then they'd slice their stomachs open and their throats so the bodies wouldn't swell in the heat and they wouldn't give away the burial spots. But the reason we know that we killed that many was because an infantry group came through and swept that area, I think 2 days later, and actually found where they buried these bodies, which was about 200 yards away. And that's what Puff was firing at, because they throw flares out first. It's a flare ship too, and so they light the ground up, and they can see movement down there, and that's when they open up and fire. So we knew that we'd killed more than a dozen, and most of them were killed in that first wave. But boy, they didn't hesitate. They just came at us again. They were brave little buggers, I'll tell you.
What a first night out. I mean,
Yeah.
with all of that. And I think I remember in the book at some point, either it happened to you or maybe another group that you had mentioned that one time that they came across some because they thought they heard explosions, and it was the gases where they didn't cut them and they were blowing up underground, and were finding.
You could hear bodies burst underground if you were nearby, and it sounded like a muffled grenade. It was disgusting, of course, because you'd go there and there'd be parts of people all over the trees and things. It was bad news. It was bad news. That's a good thing for not being in the infantry. You never had to check those and sweep for bodies afterwards. That was a blessing. Those guys had it. They had it bad in so many ways. Guys like your dad. Just tough as hell over there. That was outside of our our operational order,
so to say. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I appreciate you saying that. They went through some hell. And there was about the Puff before we mentioned on. Was I think when they were on station, it was dark, and you mentioned flares just then. If they dropped flares to where it was clear enough, they could distinguish that they weren't going to be firing on you guys and could take out the NVA.
Right. We were using strobe lights in our position, and so we'd throw these lights up, and of course they'd know that was the center of our position, and we'd tell them what the radius was. So we were like 15 meters out. So from the strobe light to like 40 feet out, that was a no-go zone, but anything else was fair game. And the reason, I mean, you make a good point. The reason they would use these gunships, these Puffs, only at night was because they were so slow. C-47. I mean, it's a two-prop aircraft. They're not jets, and so they have to fire at night because they don't want to take all this ground fire, which would be pretty bad for them if they worked out during the day. So it was a nighttime gunship, and that's why they used these flare drops.
Wow. Puff and the Spectre and the gunships that y'all were able to utilize are absolutely amazing, and
they really were.
And the destruction they were able to lay down. It's just
it would sound when those miniguns would fire. You had that photograph of those two miniguns firing. It sounded like a groan coming from the air. It was the weirdest sound. It sounded like a deep, and those were these thousands of rounds coming out. It didn't even sound like a machine gun. It was just this deep-throated growl, and that was hence the term Puff, Magic Dragon. But that alone scared the pants off of me, because first of all, I didn't know what the hell it was. And I said, who the hell is firing at us? And Lurch laughed at me and said, Jesus, man, you really are a Nick, the new guy,
New in country.
You got Nick written all over you, boy. I said, well, God, you could have told me about this before this happened. I just think I wet my pants.
And I've just looked. It's Mr. Lurch Warren was his last name.
Gerald Warren, right? Yeah, good guy.
Gerald Lurch Warren. Let me write that down. Excellent. And after that, y'all do quite a bit of moving around. It seems. Is this the time to where I was surprised y'all were loading up on LSTs and moving? I know y'all went to Reasoner, but did you end up running one more mission out of Da Nang or Chu Lai to where y'all actually got close to the Lao border on one operation?
Oh, what we did was that we ran one more patrol out of Chulai before the battalion moved up to Da Nang. And that was, we went out to a place, there's a book actually that's been written out, that's just been published about Operation Swift, which was in a valley that was not far from Da Nang. And this book was just published about 2 or 3 weeks ago by a veteran from Operation Swift. And oh, there you go. Look at you. You're a wild man, bud. How in the world? Yeah, that's good. That's excellent. That's exactly what it is. That was in what, September, I think, of 67, wasn't it?
September 3rd.
September 67. That's when I think the 3rd Marines were involved in that. And they were operating in a company-sized or battalion-sized area, and they ran into an NVA regiment in this valley at the time. And we were on a hill about 2 k's away when the fighting did. Oh my God, it was awful. It was awful. They had platoons and companies completely cut off from one another, from these NVA. We, about the second night in, on this hilltop, it was about 2 a.m. and I was on radio watch, and I hear this massive rush in the bush. It sounded like 1,000 people were coming, and in fact, it was 2 companies of NVA that ran right by our position on their way down into the valley to join the fight. We hit a claymore there. I don't know if we killed anybody, but they didn't even stop for us because we were small fry. They didn't even hesitate. They didn't throw a round in our way. They didn't throw a grenade. They just kept on going right down to the valley. If it had been any other time, they'd have wiped us out. But they were headed to a bigger fish, which was that Marine battalion that was down there. And that operation went on for about 3 days. And Marines lost a couple of hundred men killed in action. Had a Medal of Honor recipient, a reverend, who was killed while he was assisting wounded men. And he was a Navy chaplain. A Medal of Honor. I think there were 2 other Medals of Honor awarded. And they killed 600 or 700 NVA in that fight. Operation Swift. That was just a mean firefight, mean battle.
Yeah. I mean, it was as you said, a division. The 165 men of Mike Company came up against 6,500 men of the 2nd NVA division.
Man. So you're outnumbered. Yeah, you're outnumbered. 30 to 1 or so.
Yeah.
When you first started. And they finally pulled in the rest of the Marine battalion. But as I said, these companies and platoons were cut off for a couple of days at a time. And they were just fighting actions, and they couldn't connect with one another because there were too many NVA that were between them. And they try to make contact, and the NVA would fight them back into their own positions. It was just an awful battle. It was an awful place to be. And we watched this for the better part of almost 3 days of this fighting. We volunteered to go down there, but battalion said, "Are you crazy? Have you lost your marbles? You're not. Get ambushed before you get in there. Just understand that. Plus, you're not infantry, you bunch of dingbats. You're reconnaissance. So stay where you are, okay, and stay healthy."
Yeah, that's a good book, guys. By the way, I'll post the Amazon link for you guys to check it out. It's a very good book. Let's see here. And now you mentioned are y'all now at Da Nang for a while?
We're at Da Nang now. Yeah, we got shipped up to Da Nang because they were reorganizing the division. So we let's see, I had 2 patrols down at Chulai, and I had 2 more patrols up in Da Nang. The first one was fairly uneventful. The second one was where we were slated to go into a place called Antenna Valley, which was about 15 k's west of Da Nang, fairly close to the Laotian border, as you pointed out a moment ago. And that's where we got our asses handed to us. The thing was that our platoon commander, as I told you, had gotten killed about a month before, and we were left in the hands of this staff sergeant who used to be a DI at San Diego, but he was not an infantry DI. This guy had come from another MOS, and I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't infantry. It could have been artillery or something. What the hell he was doing in recon is beyond me. Recon straightened that out after I left. They made sure that your MOS, when you were connected with the unit, was exactly what Recon was looking for. But in the early days, they were pretty much taking guys who volunteered to go, because there weren't many of us who did volunteer for it. So they were taking people who might not necessarily have that kind of combat training. Hence this guy from the MPs and this fella from, I think it was artillery, which is ironic because he got us lost the first day we were out in the bush. And he decides that he's going to call for a spotter round from a 175. You can't call a spotter round from 175. So those things are so inaccurate. They're notoriously inaccurate, as you well know. You can fire a round in on a grid square, a 6-digit grid coordinate. You can call for the same round on the same grid square, and it'll be 1,000 meters off. They were used for random shelling. They weren't used for precision shelling, but it was the only battery that we had available at the time. And this guy had no idea where he was, even though we were telling him. He calls his 175 in, and it hits down. It splashes about probably 2,000 yards away. And we could see it, but he says he wants a confirmation. So battery fires another 175. We hear this thing coming in. It sounded like a freight train on steroids. It was the loudest, most unnerving, beastly sound you can ever imagine. It's just this incredibly loud whine as it's coming in, and it's coming in right at us. We're on this hilltop, and this thing, just before it splashed, the radio operator says, "Okay, shot," from the battery. And we say, "Roger, shot out." I was a radio operator. And he says, "Splash," which means this thing's going to hit. And as he says splash, we hear it coming in. It came, if you imagine the hilltop like this, the round came in just over the hilltop like that. It couldn't have missed the top of us by more than about 30 feet and landed at the bottom of the ravine. So it literally came in on our heads. If we'd been on flat land, we'd have been killed, because this thing would have hit so close to us. You know what the size of a 175 is. It's huge. It'll destroy anything within. Those things would destroy anything within about 500 yards. But it just came over the top of us, and hit right on the hillside, threw up all kinds of debris and stuff all over us. It took our breath away. It was so close, it took our breath away. And he figured, yeah, okay, I know where we are now. All right, moron that he was. And that was only one example. We knew we were going to have trouble on that patrol. We knew it was going to be a bad scene, because before we got inserted, we loaded at our ready pad in Da Nang, and we flew out in these old 34s. And you know what they look like, these big teardrops. They're old Korean War vintage ships. As we were coming in to our LZ, you could see the NVA and main force VC. These were not regular VC. The main force VC were trained as well as NVA were. In fact, a lot of the main force worked with NVA units. They were that good. They were pouring out of the tree lines and firing at us. We went in with five choppers plus gunships. And there must have been 150 of these NVA that poured out of this tree line and were firing at us from the ground. We were up at about maybe 500 feet. And all you saw were these, they used green tracer. We used red, they used green. Going right past our doors, through the blades of the chopper. And that's the valley we were landing in, where they saw us coming in. So this guy had picked a very poor insert point anyway. And then we landed and we started getting sniped at immediately. We got sniped at for 2 or 3 days until we landed on that hilltop. And then after 2 days up there, this guy, the staff sergeant, decides, well, let's go down to our extract point. But hey, I got an idea. Let's use the same trail we did going down that we used coming up. That's a good idea. We had NCOs who said, Staff Sergeant, this is insane. You can't leave a position the same way you came in. You just can't do that. We've got to find another way. Oh, look at you, man. You've done your, look at that. You are a research specialist, aren't you?
Oh.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. There's Elephant Valley. Yep. And Happy Valley. That was a horrible place. Yeah. So we were, we were actually very close to Happy Valley. It was a valley, sort of one valley over. And you can see there was a main route that runs through there. And that's what we were designed to do. We're trying to, pick up infiltration routes. So we come down the same way we went up, and they were waiting for us. There were probably maybe a reinforced platoon, I'd say maybe 30 or 40 that were sitting in an L-shaped ambush. We walked right by them. They were very good at this sort of thing, and they caught us in crossfire, and they did us a number. And that's when I got hit so badly.
And I mean, it's on this one. It's not just you. Is this the one where Mr. Porter's paralyzed
Yeah, he got hit by a spent round, which is I'm sure you well know that. It's a round that sort of goes up in the air and comes down without all of the force behind it, all of the sort of muzzle velocity behind it. I mean, so an AK round leaves at about, what is that, about 2,900 feet? Is that about right? Does that sound about right to you? Mm-hmm. Muzzle velocity on that, something like that. This thing probably hit him at maybe 700 or 800 feet per second, which hit him square in the throat and exited right past his neck. And he ended up being, of course, paralyzed with that. How I didn't get killed is beyond me. And we had a machine gunner was just ahead of me. He got hit in the chest, and it took his shoulder blade right out his back. I just saw this huge patch of white on his back, as I thought was a bandage, but it turned out to be his left shoulder blade. We had our point man, kid by the name of Heads, who got shot right square in his belt buckle, and it drove that belt buckle right through him and out his back. I don't know how the guy lived. It was extraordinary that he lived. And we had about 4 other guys get hit. And then I got hit from a guy who was in a tree. He was about 30 feet up in a tree and about 30 feet away. And he nailed me as I was ducking behind a bush. And I took 2 rounds in the upper right thigh. The third round hit me in the stomach and went out through my back. So we had wounded all up and down the line. And I was the second man to get medevaced out. First was the kid who got hit up front. Heads was the first out. Now, we were in triple canopy at that time, Bud, so you couldn't land a chopper in there. And what they ended up doing was lowering an air-sea rescue hoist that you use for downed pilots. And so they dropped this rescue hoist down, and our corpsmen and guys would put them into the hoist, and then they'd be pulled up through this triple canopy. So Heads went out first, and then I followed. And that's when we they were firing at us, of course, as we were being pulled up. And that chopper ended up, I found out later, it took something like 17 or 18 hits while it was hovering over me, pulling me up through the triple canopy. And one of the door gunners got hit. And the pilot, it was the pilot or the co-pilot, I think it was the co-pilot who got hit also. And the thing was spewing oil and this orange sort of fluid coming in, sort of a brake fluid or whatever it was, rotor fluid, was coming down from the rotors all over the inside of this chopper, all over me, all over the door gunners, as we were flying back to Da Nang. And when this thing landed, I guess it had taken so much rotary damage and so much engine damage that it landed, but it couldn't it couldn't get up again. It had to taxi off the runway because it couldn't lift off again. It had just been shot up so badly. And that's when I went into 1st Med Battalion Hospital at Da Nang and had, pretty extensive surgery.
Is this that mission, or is this a different area
That's
that
another
y'all
one.
were?
That's Bob Lansing. We were up at Quezon with that photograph right there. He thought it was very funny. We were getting rained on, and he was a wild man. He liked the rain for some reason. I don't know why. He was the only person I ever knew who liked the rain. But you can see he's enjoying it. He was during the monsoons, and Bob was a veteran of Fox 2-3. He was up at Quezon, got wounded 3 times at Quezon, did infantry. He was rushing the hill with the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, Lou Walt. They went up 881 South, and he got hit. His whole right arm, you can't see it, but the whole right arm was scarred up from, he got hit by a 122 rocket on the way up there. And he's got all these wounds in his chest. He got hit 2 or 3 times. He got shot once. It was in either his lower or upper leg. Silver Star, that guy was a badass. And he was this team leader of mine at the time we were up at Quezon. But yeah, he liked the bush. He just liked the bush. He became a software engineer with Xerox after the war. Yeah, lived up in New York, White Plains, New York. Good guy.
That is absolutely amazing. Wow, that is just neat. I thought I had some pictures of Elephant Valley and Happy Valley that Mr. Babin had sent me and Andy had sent me. I've got some photos. Maybe you'll recognize some areas here.
Yeah, honestly, but all that stuff looked the same to me.
Yeah, I wish we had them labeled. I did have them labeled, and I know some of these are Happy Valley, but some of these are on the yellow brick road.
The one you showed just a moment ago with the guy with the grenade strapped to his chest, that was a smoke grenade or CS. I couldn't tell. We carried
that
gas
was Force Recon legend and SOG NAD man, Captain Fred Vogel.
Yeah,
quite the operator. I'm sure you know of Fred Vogel.
Heard the name. Yep.
Let's see. Oh, before I show any more pictures, when we get to some of your last stories here, because we're coming up on 2 hours here. The when you got extracted, and you mentioned I guess it was a king bee using the hoist where you're laying in the basket. I can only imagine the terror that you got to be going through, knowing they're shooting at you and wanting to get the heck out of that basket. And then the team, as you left, you said you felt very, very bad about it. Is this the same part where they actually are on the ground another 5-6 hours and have to rig their packs with C4?
Yeah. They managed to get out. They had everybody extracted except I think there were 3 or 4 guys that were left on the ground, and it was getting towards dark at that time. They'd already lost 2 choppers shot down, and they'd rescued the crews, but the choppers had gotten blown right out of the air into the valley floor. These guys had one more shot at getting extracted, or they were going to have to be left there for the night, and they would have never survived. You can imagine. By that time, there were probably 200 or so main force and NVA in the area, at least. This is what I was told afterwards from a good friend of mine. He wrote to me later. Still got the letter. He said there were at least 2 companies that were in the area. There was all kinds of artillery coming in and so on. They even had some fixed wing strikes that were coming in. Of course, they pull the choppers out of the area when that takes place. But they stopped all of that. The guys that were left on the ground, 3 or 4 of them, took all of the packs from our guys that had been extracted, all the ammunition, all the grenades, all the C4, we had some more, and put all the ordnance in a pile that was the size of say a desk you would have in your office right there. Put a block of C4 in there, put a blasting cap in the C4, and had a timing device of, I think it was 3 or 4 minutes that they put on this. They then popped the timing device and hoofed it down the rest of the trail. And miraculously, these guys found a hole in the NVA line that they actually were able to squeeze through. One guy got hit a couple of times going through, but they actually made it out of that ambush area, down about 100 yards through the rest of the hilltop, out into the valley floor, and got pulled up by this emergency medevac chopper, who I think this guy ended up with a Silver Star, the pilot did, as I recall, picked these guys up. And as they lifted up, or as they had gone down the trail, these NVA converged by the dozens and scores on this pile of equipment that had been left there. And as these guys were getting pulled up on the emergency extract, this thing blows. And the guy who wrote to me about this said you could see bodies coming up through the trees with they had probably put 20 or 25 pounds of C4 in there with these claymores. And they said there was this huge explosion that blew this hole through the treetop, and bodies came up through there like mushrooms. He said they must have killed probably 40, 50 NVA right there. As many as converged on that, they were all killed. And they got out of there. Literally, they got out of there at the very last minute. It was a hell of a bad scene.
I mean,
but that's
yeah,
what it took. I mean, these guys were, it's just original thinking. These guys they were all the same age. We were 20, 21 years old. We were just kids. And these guys had the wherewithal to put this plan together and think on their feet. This was a corporal who did this. He's living down in Mississippi, Alabama right now. I can't remember. Florida. He's a hell of a good guy. But he thought this up. He's 21 years old. He was on his third tour, mind you, and that was their plan, and it worked. It worked to a T. But he just had this vision of these bodies and parts of bodies that were flying up through these trees. He said the pilot was absolutely stunned. Absolutely stunned. He said he'd never seen anything like that before. To see these things, these people flying through the air. That was his lasting image. But that was what that scene was. That was a hairy ambush site.
It was, because as you mentioned in the book, I mean, it could have, I mean, you actually could have been left paralyzed, and it goes into, mean, you get back and you are wanting a menthol, you wanting a cigarette, and someone luckily has a menthol, and you start smoking it and immediately realize you've got to get some help, and you're off to x-rays. And one of the funny thing, or not funny, but one of the interesting thing is in your recovery process, which is utter hell, but to start it all off, you run into a female colonel who is you're naked and getting ready for surgery, and it happens to be the famous Colonel Martha Raye with you.
Yeah, she was a comedian who used to go over to Europe during World War II. She's been dead a long time. A lot of guys who are much younger than I am probably never heard of her. But back in the 40s and 50s and 60s or so, she was really very, very famous as a comedian and a singer. She did these variety shows. She had albums out. She was really well known. But she was also trained in World War II as a combat nurse. And in Vietnam, 4 or 5 visits over there. And on one occasion, she went in as a surgical nurse in an emergency for a soldier. In fact, the guy was a special forces operator who got hit down south. and she happened to be there in the hospital at the time, and she volunteered to go in, and they took her because they knew of her credentials. So she helped operate on this kid who got hit working down south out of was in the Central Highlands, I think it was. But she was there when I got wounded, and I had the sheet over me. I'd been completely shaved from my chest down to my knees, and I just had this sheet over me, but I had blood all over the place. And I had this cami makeup on, and she comes in and says, how you doing, kid? And gives me a kiss on the forehead and the name Raye over her breastplate. And so it was, I mean, everybody knew who she was. I thought, I asked the corpsman, I said, is that Martha Raye? And he said, oh yeah, she's an honorary colonel in special forces. And then I went into surgery right after that.
I mean, what a lady she is, and there she
There you
is.
go. There you go.
And I wish I had the photo handy, but I've got a photo of her talking to a 3rd Force Recon team that's about to go out on a patrol. That Mr. Rick Rabinold was in the line, and I'll put that up, guys. I've got it on my phone, and if it wouldn't take so long, I'd pull it up. But that's a wonderful photo. I'll share, and I'll send it to you, Mr. Cronin, for you to see it too. It's she loved the SF especially and the SAW guys, but she loved all of the American troops, and she was with the Recon Marines a lot. If guys don't know, I'll go in before we get into the rest of it. I mean, the entire house, a portion of her house was named the team room, and it is plaques from wall to wall everywhere in the entire section of that house from each unit she's with, that they gave her plaques or mementos, team shot photos that they took with her. I mean, she kept everything, and that was a big piece of her heart. And she actually gave her address to guys and said, if you're in California and need somewhere to stay or live for a time, and guys took her up on it. She was that legit. Yeah.
How about that?
I love that.
She was on the Bob Hope show that used to tour there every Christmas. She used to tour with him, and then she'd go off on her own and go to these hospitals. She went to the hospitals all the time, constant presence. Hospitals all the way from Saigon up to the D.
And for y'all that don't realize, this is one of her early, when she was an actress. This is what Colonel Maggie used to look like. She was quite the starlet in her day. Singer, dancer, comedian. She and then, as Dr. Cronin said, she's the real deal. She's a medic and a doctor. And as a matter of fact, I've heard numerous times during some of the sapper attacks at CCC that she was at, she actually helped out and saved some boys' lives when the power was down and all that. So she's quite the lady.
She donated a lot of blood. She used to donate blood all the time. She was a real deal.
You've got her, and then you've got the likes of the people like Hanoi Jane and all of that doing what they were doing. And we won't even get started on her garbage self. This is where you go through a rough spot for a good period of time before you can get back to Force Recon. Would you like to speak about the issues? I mean, you're having to get Demerol. The pain is unbelievable. You're traveling 10,000 miles, leaving Vietnam, going to Alaska, and instantly leaving 100-degree heat with humidity to it being negative 45. I mean, could you speak a little bit about your injury process and what was going on?
That bullet that hit me clipped the in the stomach, clipped the appendix off very neatly. So I'll never have appendicitis. But it also took about 4 or 5 feet of small intestine with it, and part of my spinal column, not the spinal cord, but the spinal column. Half the bullet came out through the back, and half is still back there. I've still got it lodged right next to the spine. So I had what was called laparotomy, which is where they open you up from the sternum and the chest right down to the pelvis, and they sort of peel your stomach back, and then they go in there and they will do what's known as a debridement, where they pick up all the pieces of shrapnel and so on. But by the very nature of the operation and the extensive wounds, they rarely find everything. So there are still multiple pieces of bullet that are in the abdominal cavity. And I see this on every x-ray, plus this shard that's still in my spinal cord. And then all my intestines have been kind of sewn back together. So it looks like kind of a road map that stopped being a road map. And it's very abbreviated. I've got a very abbreviated intestinal tract. Gastroenterologists find truly fascinating. I have to explain that before I ever go in for a kind of x-ray. But that stomach surgery was just awful. And, you know, you have a lot of muscle in that area. They have to cut right through that muscle. Your muscle runs laterally, and they have to cut right through the center of it. So all that muscle is torn open, and it's ungodly painful. So I was on Demerol, about 4 milligrams of Demerol, which is a hell of a lot, every 4 hours, 3 to 4 milligrams, and that could probably kill some people, I suppose. But I was always told that if you're in genuine pain and genuine discomfort, and you take these narcotics, these really hard-hitting, heavy narcotics, and you really need them, that you're unlikely to get addicted to that stuff unless you start taking them when you don't need them. And then you get hooked on that, and that's where a lot of your drug addicts come from, being wounded or injured, car accidents or so on. You've got to know when to say no. You've got to know when to quit. And if the doctors think you're faking it and that you're not really in that pain, they'll cut you off anyway. So you've got to be very candid with them and tell them the truth. But I had that severe pain for about 2 weeks. And a doctor comes in one day, captain, young guy, Air Force captain. This is in Clark in the Philippines. And I complained that, God, man, this just hurts so damn much. And he said, well, where? And I said, well, right here in the stomach. So the guy takes his finger and jams it into my stomach. I'm thinking, I'm probably going to I'm going to have to get peeled off the ceiling for this. This is going to hurt like hell. I didn't feel a thing, because what he'd done was he'd opened a huge, huge pocket of infection there where gangrene had started to set in. So I was down in surgery about an hour later. And what did they do? They cut open those wounds that were just starting to heal. Now I had to go through that again. And I just about lost my mind. It was just terrible. 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks over in the Philippines. And then they will medevac you to the States only if you are on nothing stronger than like Darvon, which is a capsule. It's a pretty strong aspirin, you might say. But they don't want you to travel. I was flying in a big old Air Force C-141, just packed from stem to stern with wounded. We were all on stretchers up the fuselage, all on top of one another. And they won't fly you back. They wouldn't fly you back in those days from the Philippines to the States unless you were off the serious pain medication. Another thing they never told you was that if they thought you were going to die, they wouldn't ever medevac you in country, or you'd go to Iwakuni, Japan, and that's where you would die. So you knew that if you were slated to go to the States, you had a pretty good chance of recovery. And as you pointed out, we landed in, it must have been 110 outside in Manila then. We flew into Fairbanks, Alaska. This was in November now, mind you, midwinter up there. And it was so far below zero that these nurses came on board, and the women who passed out coffee and donuts, and they had these hoods on. You could only see their eyes and their noses. That's how bundled up they were. It was so cold out there. And then we, flew back to Friendship Airport in Baltimore, and then we got medevac buses I went to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that's where I ended up there for another 3 months until I recovered. And then that's when I volunteered to go back to Vietnam. And that was in by that time it was June of 68.
Yeah. And covering, there's a lot of interesting stories of some very fun young ladies you meet along the way and have some dalliances with that are very fun stories that I think everyone will enjoy.
Oh yeah. Well,
Uh,
I had a volunteer nurse in Bethesda who was older than I. I was about 20 then. She was probably 25, but she was working on training to be a regular surgical nurse, and part of her duty was come into the wards where all the wounded were, and then take care of them and do basic stuff for them, change dressings or so on. And I'm sorry that I couldn't walk around in those days because she was a certifiable little fox. Um, but I couldn't do anything about it. And she understood that. And so she was mean as hell because she'd flirt and she knew I couldn't follow up on this. It was a torturous. She should have been court-martialed for that. To treat a veteran that poorly. It was awful. It was awful. Boy, I wish I'd been able to, if I could have just gotten out of bed and, well, but
well,
older.
you make up for it with Kitra and Rhodesia, as we'll learn about, and some of while you're waiting to get back to Vietnam, you actually have a young lady, I think it maybe Leslie, who takes care of you, and y'all have to
Yeah,
split ways because y'all know that she can recognize you love her and care for her, but you love the military and love protecting the oppressed, if you will, more than you were looking to settle down at that
that's
point in
right.
time. Um, and
Well, she was a good girl. I was like 20 by that time. She was about the same age. She just graduated from college, and she she thought maybe I would stay back there and we could make something of it. And if I hadn't decided to go back, we would have probably been together. I suspect we would have gotten married. But um, that draw to go back to the bush was just too strong. Oh, that's nice of you to say. Thank you. Thank you, Mary Jo.
Mary Jo is great. She's a great she's always with us and commenting and reading great books with us. I
Okay.
thought you'd like that comment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I agree, Mary Jo. He had a lot of fun, and those that will get the book or have read the book will understand. Before we get into Vietnam, because we're here at the 2 hour mark, and I don't want to go too long, or people will it'll take them 3 days to watch it. But I mean, you're still healing, and you meet a nice girl, and I think you end up going back to the VMI midwinter party with one of your old friends, Charlotte, and you run into a shall we say, a turd who is putting down the USMC and soldiers.
Yeah, we were. Yeah, she was my sister, Charlotte, and she was
Sister, I'm
dating a
sorry.
guy. Yeah, that's okay. She was dating a guy from VMI at the time. So the class that I'd been with they were now juniors or second classmen, and they invited me down, and she was dating a guy from my class. So she and I decided to go to Lexington, Virginia together. And she had gotten ready in the hotel, and while she was getting ready, I was at a bar called Johnny's. And this is where a lot of VMI classmen would go into the back room. You weren't allowed to drink at VMI. So these guys had to go into the back room and drink surreptitiously. And the university, the school, knew what was going on, but they would not intervene. They just let some secrets stay secrets. And as I was waiting at the door to get picked up by a taxi to go over to school, this drunk guy from WNL, Washington Lee University, a few years older than I, started giving me a really hard time about baby killers and this and that and anti-war and so on. And I finally had enough of that clown. So I said, look, you really are serious about this. Let's just step into an alley and sort this out. So he came with me, and I ended up breaking his nose. I also broke my hand really, really nicely. Yeah, it's still broken. I still can't put a lot of pressure on it. My father would have been ashamed of me. He was a boxer at VMI, and he had died by that time. But he would have said, didn't I teach you to close your fist tightly before you do something stupid like that? But it did break. But I got his nose in the meantime. And anyway, we had that dance over there. I saw my old classmates, and they were they were it was a good reunion. Let's just put it like that. That was before that was a couple of months before I went back to Vietnam.
And I hate you broke something, but he with what he was saying, he absolutely deserved everything that he received that evening.
The funny thing was, I go back into the bar, and about 5 minutes later, he picks himself up and he comes back in there, and he got blood all coming down him, and he goes for me again, and I punch him again,
Mhm.
and there's kind of women in there screaming, and as that happened, these cops pull up in a car. Somebody had called them. They come in there, they cuff this guy. They didn't look at me once. Dragged him out by the cuffs, threw him in the back of this car, and took off. And that was it showed a couple of things. There was a lot of respect for guys in uniform, and two, they didn't want to see people harassed by clowns who didn't know what they were talking about and who had never been down that path before. And these cops understood that. They were probably veterans themselves. And so as I said, they never even glanced at me before they hauled this guy off. And he got charged with drunken disorderly and resisting arrest and a couple other, I guess they were misdemeanors. But I never saw him again. What a clown. Baby killer.
He definitely racked up a good ass whooping and also some charges to go along with denigrating the Marine Corps and a veteran that night.
Yeah, he spent. I know he spent the weekend in jail. He probably got bonded out, but uh, it was funny to see the guys in the bar that these are all college students, and they I don't know if they'd ever seen a fight like that before, but it sort of told them that veterans are going to be respected by law enforcement. That's just the way things were in those days, and they still are, of course. And it pretty much displayed that relationship between the two, you might say, organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I was so happy for that part that they literally didn't even give you a second look. And one of the some of the onlookers seemed to have struck a fancy to you with how you handled yourself also. That
Well,
uh that
there was a waitress in there who was considerably older than I. She was probably in her probably late 30s, maybe early 40s. But she said her brother had been a Vietnam vet, and she had all the respect in the world for that. Anybody who'd been over there, he was Army, and so we sort of flirted until my taxi came. But you got to make the break, and duty calls, doesn't it, Bud? Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And guys, y'all see, we're gonna go ahead and get into Vietnam since we just crossed 2 hours, and I don't want to get us too long. But the doc, he kind of gets stuck in a tight spot. He has to go on some cruises, which all isn't that bad in the swing of things. He learned some stuff, but really, he's wanting to be in combat, and that wasn't his forte, if you will. He ended up getting assigned to a battery with 2nd Battalion, 10th Marines, and that was the last straw. He knew he needed to start working. He got in some touch with some majors and started working best he could. And he had one last great meetup with a young lady named Leslie. Was very glad to hear about that story and got to see what all he did, and that's a wonderful story that y'all need to see. And then he's got to go to Gitmo for a bit before Vietnam. But would you like to talk to about when you got into? I believe you said by '68, you Third Force was at Quang Tri now.
Yeah. Funny enough, when I volunteered to go back, we flew into the same Butler building in Da Nang that I'd been to a year and a half before, exactly the same building. And they were asking the same questions, and they were asking for the same volunteers. And finally, my guy stood up and said, "We've got one quota for a radio operator for Third Force Recon. It's up at Quang Tri, which is north of Da Nang." And I thought, hell yeah, man, that's my call. So I stood up, And there was this guy who'd been reading a book next to me, and he said, man, do you know what you're doing? You know what those guys do out there? They go out there in these teams of 4 and 5 men. You get hung out to dry. Nobody's going to come for you. You're in the middle of nowhere. Have you lost your rabbit ass mind? I said, well, otherwise it might sound like it, but I've done this sort of thing before, and I sort of know what to expect, and I'm prepared for it. He said, your funeral, bud, your funeral. So I got on a C-130 and I flew up there and I landed that afternoon, and I was in the bush. The recon didn't waste time. I think I went in the bush the next, or 2 days later. Drew all my equipment. I've got the, in fact, this is the Arvin pack that I carried over there.
Wow.
You can see that. Same, it's exactly the same as it was when I carried it in Vietnam. And so I'd carry a canteen here in this pouch right here. I'd carry 2 here, 2 here, and 2 here. And then I'd carry another one here in that. So that was 2, 4, 6, that was 8. Then I carried 3 more in my inside the pack itself, and I'd carry 1 in my side pouch. So I had 13 canteens over there because I went through a lot of water. But this Arvin pack, it was a South Vietnamese pack that was designed back in the early 60s, and the Marines and the U.S. Army adopted it, and it was it was great. This thing made out of nylon. This is 60 years old, and it feels like it's brand new. And here, where you could put on, you could hook on a bayonet or something along those lines, and it had the same thing on the other side, right here, where you could hook things on. It was the best pack I've ever had. I carried this in Rhodesia too, so it was a godsend. I had a guy who rotated back from Vietnam to the States who gave that to me. So that thing had been in Vietnam for probably 3 years when I got it, and who knows who had it before him. But that's what I carried. And you have these doggy straps that come over your shoulders, and you can carry canteens in the back from that, plus your magazines go in the front. And I carried a shotgun over there a couple of times, a Stevens 77 pump, 12 gauge pump, and I used flechette rounds in those things. And those were rounds on a 12 gauge that contained these like aluminum darts. There were like 12 or so aluminum darts that were packed into every one of these rounds. And you shoot these, and they would actually penetrate you. They end up pinning NVA to trees sometimes when they got hit. There were artillery rounds that carried flechettes too. A lot were used up where your dad was up at WWII. They helped clear streets out. Your dad would have known all about flechettes. So when I carried a shotgun, I would use those, or I'd carry the double-aught buck, 12 gauge double-aught bucks. And I carried a shotgun on probably 4 or 5 patrols. Other than that, I'd carry a 16. And that was pretty much the equipment. We had a corpsman, and he'd carry, of course, he had only 45 because he had so much medical gear with him. We'd have a man who carried M79 grenade launcher. We called him a blooper because that's what it sounded like when the round was fired, just a bloop, bang. And some teams would carry a guy with an M14 and a sniper scope. So it depended on the teams that you had. We had one guy that used to carry a Swedish K, 9mm.
Oh.
It was pretty much, free for all. You could carry pretty much what you wanted in force. In the infantry, it was a little different. They were very standardized, but in force, we were sort of a different group that the Marines made allowances, you might say, for us. And I'm sure the guys in Special Forces and SEALs and so on probably had the same advantages. They could often carry the same equipment, the equipment that they wanted. You tried to be standardized because you want to make sure that if you lose your weapon, you can pick up another weapon and you're going to be able to use the same ammunition. So you want to be as standardized as possible, and that's what the infantry wanted. But in recon, the missions were so specialized that sometimes they called for different kinds of weapons, and that's what that's what we sort of relied on, our design and our wish to carry different ordnance and so on, and we were allowed to pretty much.
One of the big questions that I get, and some of the people get on from questions we have when we do have a force recon vet, but considering we've got you with experience in battalion and now with third force, could you explain a little bit the difference between battalion recon and what force was doing?
That's a good question. The guys who went with battalion usually ran larger teams. They'd probably run 8, 9, 10-man teams. We would generally run 4-man, sometimes 5, but rarely more than that. It's not that the missions were different. It's just that the approach was a little bit different. Force also had the option to go to more schools than battalion did. So with force, I was able to go down to Recondo school. I got trained by special forces down in Trang. Boy, that was a great school. 3 weeks, man, it was wonderful. There were a couple of battalion guys, but most of the quotas and billets came down for guys from force. We also had more billets for guys to go to jump school in the Philippines and also scuba school down in the Philippines. Each was a month long. There were some battalion guys who got the quotas, but most of them went into force itself. We also had missions where we went out on snatches, where our design was, the mission was to go out, capture NVA, and bring them back. And you couldn't really do that with a big team. You just make too damn much noise if you're going to get close to NVA. So that's why they put small teams in for those sorts of missions. They didn't come up often. In fact, I never went on one, but I knew guys who did. And the snatches worked. Most of the time, they worked pretty well. 75% of the time, they got the people. So those were the sort of the inherent differences between battalion and force. There was also a little jealousy. I hate to say that, but there was some jealousy between battalion and force because they thought we were the highest, because we had all the schools and we got more quotas than they did, and it was really too bad that happened. Because hell, I worked in battalion. I wasn't jealous of any guy in force, but the sort of cachet with force was, it's only one company in a division, just one. So in Vietnam, there were only 2 companies of force recon in the whole country, whereas you had a whole battalion of recon. So in the one hand, you've got 400 guys doing a job, and on the other hand, you've got only like 100 guys doing a job. And the sort of reputation preceded the group. If you said you were with force, people thought, oh boy, you've got all this training and you are a real genuine badass, aren't you? And you had to dissuade them from thinking like that because you were no better than anybody else. But we did have the option of going places that they didn't.
And sadly, since you're mentioning schools, I had saw where or heard and reading that sadly you missed out each time on your time to go to school, both with battalion and when you got to force. You got injured right there a week away.
I had the worst luck. Yep, I had the worst luck. I got on the quota when I was at battalion to go to jump school down in the Philippines. Now that was a month away. I thought, holy man, that is great. They put me on a quota because I was a specialized radio operator. I had the Morse code stuff and blah, blah, blah. And then 3 days later, I get hit in this ambush. So bang, that's out of the question. I get to force a year later, and I'm slated to go to scuba school down in the Philippines. That's another month away. Holy moly. I went through the test. We had to run, it was a 10-mile run that we had to do out on really hard road. And I tore the meniscus in my knee, the cartilage in my knee on that run. That put me out. I couldn't go to scuba school. And plus 2 weeks later, I get hit again in the shoulder. So that puts that quota out of bounds. So I never did get to scuba or jump school when I was with force. I had to go to Rhodesia to get trained for combat jumps. Anyway, I did get a couple of decent schools though. I went to the Recondo school, as I said, and amphibious recon. I was able to get to that in California, so all was not lost. But I really missed going to jump and scuba with the Marines.
And that definitely your jump, not only you learning in Rhodesia, but the Rhodesian jump school and jump history, that I know that people are going to be interested and have already asked for me to take notes and ask about that. So I know that will be coming up. I wanted to show a picture of
Yep.
you as you're with Third Force now. I believe this is when you were
I'm with
with
Third
Third
Force.
Force.
I am. I'm running from a working party right there. I didn't escape. The guy caught me. I had an apple, which I took out of mess hall, which you shouldn't have. I was doing everything wrong. I wasn't running fast enough. The son of a bitch got me, and I ended up having to fill sandbags. It really pissed me off. But I almost made my escape because I was a pretty good escape engineer in those days, but I didn't beat that rap right there.
That's a great photo, and I've got some photos of some of your areas when we start to close out that you can speak of. But one more question before we get into some of your operations with Force. What was the as a Marine, I should say, what was the Recondo school like for you? I know it was good, but how did it work out for you personally?
This was for Recondo School is run by Special Forces out in Nha Trang, and boy, those guys were jacked. They were really, really good. These are all senior NCOs who trained you. It was by selection only. So, as I said, most of the guys on my quota were from Force. There were a couple of battalion. There were like 6 or 7 of us who went down there, and it was billed as advanced patrol leading. So, what they would build on is what you already knew, and then they would refine some of the patrol techniques, some of the early warning devices you could use, some of the ambush techniques, some breaking contact, some emergency ways to contact choppers if you didn't have a strobe, or if your strobe was sort of on the blink or whatever, they'd show you ways to contact aircraft and so on. How to use different frequencies on radios for different nets to get on nets and so on, emergency extract nets and so on. Exiting choppers off of ropes and off of rope ladders, emergency extracts using ropes to pull you up. There you go. There you go, right there. That's a perfect example. These were Hueys. These are called slicks because they had just gun pods on the side, and the gunship had nothing but you can see they just have a couple of machine guns there, but the slicks themselves, the Huey slicks, would have just these machine gun positions here for door gunners. There's one on the other side too, and then the troops, and that's a recon team right there, 6-man recon team, would go up in there and then they'd be inserted, whatever. Now the gunships had these rocket pods on the sides right there, and then they had the machine guns there. Oh, this is an Army team. Okay, so this must have been Special Forces team that they're working with there. The slicks and gunships were usually the insert aircraft that would circle around an area as you were being inserted by these slicks. They were called slicks because they were armored down. In other words, they didn't have much in the way of armament or weapons, and the gunships were the heavy hitters there. But that's a team that would be like a hot extract that they were training for right there with rope ladders.
That's there's y'all's front gate, I believe.
There's Recondo, yeah. Oh yeah, how about that? Yeah, look at that. I hadn't seen that. Well, I haven't seen that in since '68. Thanks, bud.
Yes, sir.
Walked right through those gates, and we were on the left there in our billet. We had a bunch of South Koreans there. We had a South Korean platoon from the White Horse Division who were there. Ooh. Those guys were wild men. They would do everything together: run, eat.
Dad used to tell me they were Yeah, the VC and NVA did not go looking for fights with Rock Marines, is what I've always been told. They took no mercy and no
No, no,
prisoners whatsoever.
no. Mm-mm,
Um,
mm-mm.
let's
Nope.
see here, Recondo School.
There
There
were
was
two divisions there. They had the
something.
White Horse and the Tiger Division.
Oh wow. Okay. I think, let's see, when you're with first your first mission with Third Force, is it the when you're in the horseshoe, or is it when you run with, or did you run with Blue Plate in the DMZ? I'm trying to
It
remember
was
what.
it was the one in, yeah, it was a horseshoe. That if you look at a map of Vietnam, you look at the Laotian border, it goes down about 15 Ks, and it's of course right alongside the western border of Vietnam, and it hooks up into South Vietnam, just like a horseshoe, and then it goes back around and sort of goes straight down again. And that area uh, was was entered through a place called the Ashaw Valley. And if you ever see the movie Hamburger Hill, they talk about the Ashaw in that. That Ashaw Valley was right smack in the middle of Horseshoe. It was without a doubt the most dangerous place you could go in northern I Corps. It was horrifically bad because it was an infiltration route for NVA coming in down the Laotian border, and they would sweep up into the Horseshoe through the Ashaw Valley and into northern I Corps. So there were always NVA there. And the first mission I ever went out on force was to go into the Ashaw, which was a gut wrenching experience because we ended up flying out of Vandergrift Combat Base. I had a team. I was with a team of there were 5 of us, and as we are going in these slicks, we have it's just one slick. There were 3 gunships around, and as they are circling our LZ, you could see one of them throw a red smoke out. Well, that's not a good sign because that meant a door gunner saw some movement on the. There you go. Yeah, that's right. That exactly looked like the horseshoe. Um, that meant that a door gunner saw movement on the ground, and he threw red smoke where he saw the movement. As soon as that red smoke hit the ground, the whole valley lit up. There were hundreds and hundreds of NVA down there. Now we were standoff. We weren't in that orbit right there. So we were stood off by maybe a K or two as these 3 gunships circle this area, and they are absolutely inundated with ground fire, just shot up. We had a couple of rounds go right through our chopper, and that's why guys would sit on their packs as they were going in. You never sat on the floor bare bottomed. You always put your pack under you because of all the ground fire that would come up through the floorboards. And 2 rounds came up through ours, right through a guy. It wasn't my pack, but it was a guy near me. Both rounds came right through his pack. And how he didn't get hit, I don't know. But it was an awful scene. And so we ended up not landing. That was called getting shot out. So we ended up getting shot out of our LZ because we just couldn't go in. They wouldn't dare put us in on that. We'd have never made it. We would have. What they would do is those little buggers would let you land, and they'd let you get off the chopper, and they'd wait for the chopper to lift off, and then they'd come for you. And I don't think we'd have lasted 2 or 3 minutes if they end up getting us in there. And I'll tell you another thing: if that air crew, if that gunship had not seen movement down there and hadn't thrown that smoke, they'd have put us in. And once they'd gotten us in, they'd have never been able to get us out. So it was just fortuitous that he was really eagle-eyed, and he saw some movement down there. I mean, they were even but they were carrying 75 mil recoilless rifles. That's how well armed these guys were. They weren't just hot dogging around with AKs. They had everything: PKMs, 61s, 122s, recoilless rifles, you name it. They were heavy hitters.
Think but you list some of the manpower and what was going on. And but let me find here. General Walt was so upset during Operation Hastings and all of that because Recon found over 100,000 men during a division on its way to the DMZ to hit Da Nang. They I think there was 3,000 ARVN plus 8,000 Marines fighting the 3045th Regiment, and it took days of airstrikes, and it was almost a 2-week fight that produced over 1,000 dead NVA, and literally tons of weapons, food, and equipment were destroyed from y'all's work that week and that month of recon in that area.
That happened before I got over there, but Hastings was probably one of the biggest operations in the war. And that is, I mentioned earlier how the NVA finally learned their lesson not to operate in these big battalion and division sized groups, because they just got their tails handed to them in Hastings and also in Starlight, which happened not long afterwards. And they were just no match for these Marine battalions. And they learned very slowly after losing what you say were thousands and thousands of men in these big operations. They thought they could go toe to toe with these, Marine battalions and so on. They just couldn't do it. They just couldn't pull it off. They didn't have that kind of conventional wartime experience. They were much better as bush fighters than conventional fighters.
I believe you put, even though, as you just said, how good they were and all of that, they were well armed, trained, and absolutely fanatical, but didn't have the infrastructure to continue the battle and do what they effectively planned. But it wasn't for a lack of fanaticism and training for them to carry it off. It was their supply lines being busted and found by you guys.
Those main force and those NVA were brave to a fault. Absolutely. I would never take that away from them. They were scary brave. And we knew that every time we went into the bush. They just weren't going to back down. Now, they might shy away from a fight if they knew it was useless to do that, but they wouldn't hesitate to engage if they thought they had an advantage, or if they thought they were even numbered against you and they had any chance at all. They would not back down for a second. And that's what made them so tough to beat.
Wow. And that's one thing I really enjoy hearing, y'all. As much as, some guys still hate them for what they did to some of their friends, which is understandable. But, some guys that say they even though they don't like them or may hate them, they respect the hell out of their determination and their fight and their skill for fighting for their country. That's one thing they will say to this day.
Not only that, but very, very few of those guys ever surrendered. Very few of them. If they had been ostracized perhaps by their unit for some reason, making a mistake, they might go across and come to our people. But it was rare that you would find an NVA who voluntarily surrendered. If you did, they were called Kit Carsons, and Recon used them as Kit Carson Scouts. When a friend of mine got shot up pretty badly on a hilltop one time, he almost lost his leg for this. I went over to see him at the 3rd Med Hospital up in Da Nang. Up in Quang Tri. He was lying in bed, and he'd been doped up on Demerol. I looked across the ward, and there was an NVA prisoner who'd been wounded, and he was handcuffed to the bed frame, and he had a Marine military policeman sitting next to him, guarding him. Well, this guy, Marine, leaves to go to the bathroom. He's gone for 5 minutes. As he left, a South Korean soldier who was also wounded in there came up to this NVA. He had a knife. He cut his throat right there in the bed, and all you saw was this geyser of blood shoot out all over the sheets. It must have shot 4 feet. It wasn't in the movies where you see this slow leak. This stuff, he got both carotid arteries, and it just exploded all over the place. And this NVA is kicking and writhing in bed. He drops this knife into a water pitcher next to him, crawls back into his bed. The MP comes back. I'm sitting in there. The MP comes back. Everybody in the whole ward is asleep. Suddenly fell asleep. This guy is as dead as the day is long. I hoof it out the door before he can ask me any questions at all. There was a huge investigation on that, but of course, nobody ever fessed up to anything at all. As far as they know, this guy cut his own throat, and it never came to anything. But there were probably 10 of us or so visiting friends in there, and man, we couldn't get out that door fast enough. But that's what the South Koreans thought of him. But that was a hell of a scene.
Another instance, guys, of what the Rock Marines were about.
Exactly.
I mean, there he is wounded, and he's going to take out that NVA right there in the bed.
No question. No question. I don't even think the MP was gone for maybe 3 minutes, if that. He just went in, bang, came back. By that time, this guy was already dead.
Yeah, I mean that's the reputation. That's why they've got that reputation to this day of being the hardcore people they were.
Yeah, they're great allies. They're great allies to have on your side. I mean, I trained with them, and I saw how steadfast they were, and they paid attention. Those NCOs were just brutal towards them. I mean, they allowed them they were like DIs at PI and San Diego. That's how they treated their enlisted if they stepped out of line. That's why they were so good and so diligent in their ethos. That's why they're such steadfast allies in Korea today. We're lucky to have the South Koreans on our side.
That's one for the books, and I'm glad that is in the book, because that is just mind blowing. I can't imagine you sitting there seeing that, to be quite honest with you.
I saw the photographs for the investigation afterwards. They passed them into force because they knew that we had people over there, because we'd had people from the company who'd been wounded. So they wanted to know if any of us had seen anything. The photographs that were taken, these were in color too. They were like something out of a horror movie. I don't think I've ever seen so much blood in my life.
Like ISIS or some crazy stuff like that back in the day, something like that.
The guy kicked so hard in the bed, he almost left the mattress to try as a result of the wounds, you know. And his hand was handcuffed in. So you have to feel sorry for the guy. I mean, geez, that's a terrible way to go.
That is, and that's a tough way. So, and again, we're here at 2 hours and 30 minutes. I did want to bring up 2 pictures, and I was going to let you cover some stuff that you might want to cover before we go, because again, guys, I said we can't go through all of this because the book is too long, and y'all need to buy it and support it. But we got the animal question we talked about earlier, but I was curious, didn't you there for a while run operations at a Mutter's Ridge and around the rock pile? And
you know, that's the Razorback right there.
Okay, that's
the Razorback. Okay. That's a Vandergrift combat base. You are looking from east to west in that photograph. If you go to the right, you're going to get right into the DMZ, just out of the frame of this photograph. And right there where your arrow is, about another inch or so, is where Mutter's Ridge, which was a horrifically dangerous place, begins. And to the left of that Razorback is the Vandergrift combat base, which was a staging area. When we flew from Quang Tri, we'd stage there. The choppers would get refueled. Then they would fly over the Razorback and then to the right and put us into the DMZ. The funny thing about the Razorback is it's exactly what it sounded. It was like a huge piece of granite, very, very thin on top. And we would have OP teams up there all the time. You know, it's a good place to OP from. But the problem was you had the rock apes up there. These were like somewhere between chimpanzees and gorillas. They were big. And Marine recon teams would get up there, and these rock apes would start throwing grapefruit at them in the middle of the night. And scary as hell because you thought these were incoming grenades or something. And they would throw this grapefruit and these huge breadfruits at you all night long. And then they'd scream, but you'd get pelted with this stuff. You couldn't hide anywhere because the rock apes were all over that place. And they would just beat the ever-living hell out of you for 5 days. And of course, at first light, they'd go hide, so you couldn't see them. And you couldn't open fire on them because you don't want to give your position away. So you just have to take it. And they knew you'd have to take it. And that's why they knocked the living hell out of you and pelted you with this stuff all night long. And then they'd screech at you like they were laughing, bastards. I never got up there, but I had friends of mine who went in the teams and said that the worst place they ever went was on the Razorback. That's a 46 right there.
Is that what y'all were using to insert and extract?
We did. We had that when I got pulled out on my first patrol, when we got so shot up on that hilltop, we climbed in the back of this 46. You had a door gunner right there on a 50 cal. Right, if you move to the right there, that's it. That open window, that was a 50 cal. And then on the other side was another 50 cal. And then you could put about 20 men on both sides of the fuselage with this. This is a great insert and extract. But if you're landing in a smaller LZ, you couldn't use these because they were just too big. So you'd go in with the slicks, which were those Huey choppers.
This is such an interesting story, and we'll show a few more pictures because a few of them tie up. We'll close out with some stories that tie up with them. But could you talk a little bit about your encounter with tigers? We always love hearing about tiger stories.
This particular tiger was killed up by a third. It was a force team that did this. This tiger right here was the same one, and they knew that because he'd been hit by the team before. They found the scar tissue on him. In an earlier patrol, he had stalked a recon team, a force team. In the middle of the night, he had jumped into the little harbor site. Now, mind you, these harbor sites were tiny. You would sleep like the spokes of a wheel, heads inboard, all your equipment and radios inboard, weapons next to you, but your heads, you were touching. You sleep close enough to touch so that if you heard something, you could wake a guy up or put your hand over his mouth. So it was a very small group, but this tiger came in, grabbed this guy somewhere on his body, pulled him out of the harbor site. They didn't find him. They couldn't find him until the next morning. And he was already half eaten. And the tiger was still there. And that's the tiger that they shot right there and killed him. And that was in that was late 68, I think, early 69. I don't remember. But I came back off of patrol and saw this thing hanging up as a result. Those things weighed in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 pounds. They were mammoth beasts, mammoth. Their paws were about the size of these two hands together. They were that big. They were just enormous, unbelievably powerful. I was with a 3-man team up in the D, probably not long after that, late 68, early 69, during the monsoons. And we had set in elephant grass that was about 6 or 7 or 8 feet high. And we had heard something stalking us. We thought it was an NVA team. And every time we'd stop, they would stop. This went on for about 2 days, and it was really eerie. I actually write about this. The third or fourth night we were in, we're huddled up. And I mean, we're close. We're like little ticks. This tiger, it was a tiger who came in and he was tracking us. And he came to within about, it couldn't have been more than 20 feet. And he roared. And it almost burst my eardrums. It sounded like an artillery round. It was the loudest roar I've ever heard. And we all fired because it scared the living bejesus out of us. Of course, we didn't hit anything. When you're that terrified, you end up probably shooting yourself more than anything else. And this thing took off. We never saw it again. But we saw the tracks where it had lay in the elephant grass waiting for us. And what I think it was waiting for was one of us to go take a pee or something, and it would have killed whoever left the harbor site. He would have been dead. Yeah, that's elephant grass right there. There you go. That's on average about 6 to 7, 8 feet tall. And those spines that you see there are so sharp. They'll cut you if you run your hand the wrong way. They'll cut you like a razor blade. If you run your hand the right way, it's like running it over a feather. But if you go back against the grain towards the root, you'll slice your finger. You could slice it right down to the bone if you're not careful. That's why everybody wore gloves over there. And that's what this thing was settling into. Only, as I said, 15, 20 feet from us. So if anybody had dared go out there, of course, not knowing that he was out there, he would have been dead. I think he got pissed off at us because we weren't making a move, and he just, said, "All right, I'm going to leave you guys alone, but I'm going to let you have it before I leave to show my frustration."
Having that thing stalking you on that elephant grass like that, is the stuff of nightmares. And could you mention how you knew that he was angry and y'all might have been in his hunting ground?
Well, those things, they cut territory out like any dominant predator. And what they'll do is they'll urinate on trees and in bush and so on, and it marks their territory, and it tells another predator, "This belongs to me, and you go somewhere else." And they generally respect that sort of unwritten law in the animal kingdom. But these were night hunters. You'd rarely see them during the day, and that's why you had to be so careful when you went out to go pee or something, because you never knew what was in the bush for you. And so that's the first thing you had to do, is be aware of your surroundings. But the second thing when you went out at night is you had to go out and come back exactly the same way. If you went out on one azimuth and came back on another azimuth, you'd get shot to death. You'd have to, because people would have to know you were going out, and then you'd sort of whistle slowly and at a low temperate, and let them know you were coming back in, but definitely come back in the same way you went out. We had a man get killed in my company who made that mistake, a new guy, a Nick, who went out one way and came back another and got shot. But the tigers would wait for you. They'd be in the bush, and they'd wait for you out there. And so you'd have to not just be aware of enemy movement, but you have to be aware of those big beasts that were sitting out there and stalking you. They were just out there. And so what the U.S. Armed Forces would do is they would hire professional Vietnamese tiger hunters that were known to hunt certain areas. And these guys would go out in teams of 3 and 4, and they would hunt these tigers at night. And then the U.S. government would pay these guys because they'd kill Americans or South Vietnamese. And I'm sure they killed NVA too. They were an equal opportunity slaughterer. And so the U.S. would hire these professionals, and they would clear these areas out of a tiger until another dominant male came in and took over his hunting area. And if you didn't worry about tigers, you had to worry about the damn snakes. You had cobras over there that were 10, 12 feet long. You had krites, which were about a foot long, and they wouldn't bite you. They would just sort of very, very calmly chew through your skin. You hardly even knew you were being bitten. And they'd inject a neurotoxin, and these things were called two-steppers, because once they injected this in, you would have a couple of steps before you'd collapse, and you'd never make it to a medevac. You'd just never make it. I don't know how many not hundreds. I think there were something like, there were a couple hundred men over there throughout the course of the war, a couple hundred who died from snake bite, either cobras or krites. And those cobras were just unbelievably deadly. They were fast. They used to hang up. They used to wrap themselves around the bamboo sticks like that. And as you'd walk by, they'd fall off these bamboo, and they'd bite you in the back or the legs or something like that. And if you didn't get a medevac out there in about 20 minutes or so, that was it for you. You were a dunner. That was it. You were gone. There's nothing they could do. And it was painful as hell. The throat would swell up. You couldn't swallow. You'd suffocate. It was the medics, the corpsmen, would have to cut a tracheotomy in your throat to help you breathe. Otherwise, you'd suffocate right there. Yeah, there were horrible ways to go there in that jungle, just dreadful ways. And the rats, I think your father mentioned about the rats up at Quezon were the worst, and he was right. They were the size of dogs, and they would you'd wake up at night and you'd feel something on your chest. You could, and you'd look up and there are these two green eyes that were looking at you, and these are rats that probably weighed 15, 20 pounds. They were absolutely enormous. And you'd punch these things, you have to punch them 2 or 3 times to knock them off your chest. And what they do is you'd have dropped food or something on your utilities, and they'd come up there and they'd eat this food off your utilities. And if they bit you, I mean, you had a chance to get plague as a result of that. So in July, when we were on the beach there, the rats used to dig down into the sand, and that's where they burrow and they build their. And when we were out in the bush, we'd throw CS gas down into these rat holes, and we'd have gas masks on, and then wait until they came out, and then the guys would go after them with bayonets. That was that passed for fun over in Vietnam, to stand by a hole and see which holes these rats came climbing out of. And if you have ever seen anything weird, it's a bunch of drunk Marines with bayonets trying to chase a bunch of crazy rats.
It seems like you and the SF men both had tried to find the best ways of getting the rats, either having them explode by putting C4 in their food, or lighting them on fire, or gasoline in their hole. We've heard all kinds of crazy stories to get rid of rats. Kyle was curious about ants.
Fast.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the ants over there, they were red ants that put our red ants to shame. And they would they'd stay in these trees, and if an artillery shell came along and knocked one of these trees over, which they did often, these ants would explode out of these trees like a geyser and just cover the ground. And you couldn't be anywhere near these things because they'd attack you. And these things were 2 inches long.
Big daddies.
They were killers. They were absolute killers. You really had to watch your step there, and be very careful when you went into an area that had been hit by artillery or had been arc lighted by B-52 bombers, because they would wipe these trees out, and these ants would just come, and they were ticked. They were ticked that you destroyed their homes, and they were ready for action. So don't go to sleep in those areas that had been recently bombed or hit by artillery, because you never knew it was going to come up and greet you in the middle of the night. I mean, you feel like your leg was on fire. That's what you feel like. Somebody held a torch to your leg when these things would bite you.
As if the NVA isn't bad enough, you got all of this.
Believe it or not, but they were even bigger than that in Africa. Oh. And they had these anthills over there 15 feet high that were made out of mud. They looked like pyramids. And these ants would climb out of these pyramids above the ground, 12, 15 feet high. And they looked like volcanoes. Put a volcano above ground, exactly. And the tops would be about 1 foot wide, and these ants would climb out of these things were as big as your hand. They were huge and red and very ill-tempered.
I'll have to dig up some photos for when we do our Rhodesia episode for those. That is unbelievable. I'm not a big fire ants, and I can only imagine if they put our fire ants to shame how bad they must be.
Yeah, they were some ass kickers, all right.
As I said, guys, we can't cover really everything, but I know 2 of these questions will come up, and I'm gonna, since we're at the 2 hours and 45-minute mark, I'm gonna let him close out with whatever he would like to. But these 2 questions were asked, and I would like to cover them if possible. Did you have a NVA sit down for lunch on one of your teammates' foot? Somebody was curious.
That happened with a guy, I don't remember his name. That happened before I got over there. The guy who knows about that is Lou Kern. It was a friend of his, and he was with a force team that had only like 3 or 4 men, and these guys had set in this NVA platoon. I think it was a platoon or a reinforced squad, so it would have been about 20 or so men, set down for a break right where these guys were. It was with a tree and some elephant grass, and they were camouflaged up. And this one NVA sat up against a tree to take a smoke break and sat on this guy's foot and thought it was part of the root system of the tree, obviously. And this guy had to sit there with his NVA sitting on his foot for about 30 minutes and not move. It's hard to make stories like this up. You know, they're so extraordinary. You could think about conjuring up this stuff, and it's impossible. This truth is so much stranger than anything that could be fabricated. Who could think up a story like that unless it were true? 30 minutes he sat there with this NVA sitting directly on the guy's foot. He rested, he leaned back, and he put his hand, as he leaned back, he put it on his shin and thought it was, I said, it's part of the root system there. I don't even know what to say to that. Yeah, Luke Kern knows all about that story. That was a good friend of his that happened to.
We've been meaning to get Mr. Lou back, and I've written that down to ask him about that. My God in heaven.
He's a great source. Good friend of mine. Great source.
He and Mr. Mike McKenna are both mentioned in your book, and those are two good men. Those are great recon Marines.
Those guys were trained the same way I was. They're both 2533s. They both were trained in Morse code and went through the same school I did. So we all have he had a great deal in common. They preceded me into force by a couple of months, but I heard all about him when I got there.
Mr. Mike, he's got quite the stories of when he was up on. It's in Doc Norton's Stingray, the history of patrols, Force Recon patrols, and I forgot where he was at doing relay from one of the sites. And
950, he was up on Hill 950, which is right south of Quezon. Yeah.
And they had a hell of a slugfest up there one evening.
That was very dangerous work on a relay. Very dangerous. Only 3 of them up there, you know.
Yes, sir. And then that's another amazing thing of you guys like Mr. Barry Babin and them running 3 patrols. We may have to close, if you wouldn't mind, with Quaviette, just because we brought it up, maybe, or we'll let you pick. But we always get this, and Mr. Mike McKenna actually mentioned maybe seeing some old foreign legionnaires out there. Did you happen to see any foreigners, either Chinese, people switching sides, African Americans, Foreign Legion, or?
I was up at Quezon. In fact, I went through 950 as a relay because you couldn't get direct comms from Quezon. It was in a valley back to my place. So you'd hit the relay and the relay would radio everything back. I was up there in late 68, maybe early 69. It was during the monsoons. And we were up on a hill that was not far from 950. And we saw a team of maybe 20 NVA. That's like a reinforced squad through our binoculars, which were 750s. And you could very, very clearly see the NVA. They averaged probably about 5'4", 5'5" in height. And you could see there were 2 men who were easily 6 feet, and they had different equipment on, different colored utilities, different combat dress. They were carrying AKs, but you couldn't really see their faces, but you could tell they were not North Vietnamese. And my guess was that these guys had been with the Foreign Legion, had been part of the French Indochina forces back in the mid 50s. And here they were 10, 12 years later. They'd either been captured or they'd surrendered, and they were now fighting with the North Vietnamese forces. I saw one case of that. I will tell you another thing. There was a Force Recon team that hit an NVA squad outside of Quezon when the battle was going up in early 68. And they killed 6 or 7 NVA. They killed 2 clear European-looking white Caucasian foreigners. killed 2 of them. They brought their bodies back to Quezon. These guys were photographed. There must have been 1,000 men who came by to look at these bodies. Clearly, these guys were white. And the commander of the base at the time, there was a colonel who said, we don't want to know anything about this. This is done deal. This goes nowhere. And they ordered this recon team to go out and bury these guys. And to my knowledge, it never really even got back to division. But these guys were clear foreigners, most likely French. And these recon team had shot them 3 ways from Sunday and dragged their bodies in about 500 yards back through the perimeter, back into headquarters. Yeah, recon team, force team. Again, this happened in Quezon in '68, early '68. I was already in the hospital by then, so I wasn't there at the time. But that was legendary within the force unit. And Lou might even know about this. He might know the guys who were involved in that. In fact, I think he does. He's got a lot more to tell you than I do.
He is the archivist. He's got it all. Maps, patrol reports, stories, contacts. He is. I'm thankful to know him and have him as a helper, or him help me out. I shouldn't say a helper, because he is not helping. Not a helper, so to speak.
Has he told you about how he got wounded? Ask him, if you have him on again, ask him how he got wounded. Anyway, I won't go into that, but it's actually pretty funny.
I don't mean to laugh. Some of the ways y'all get wounded, it is funny in a crazy way, but terrible y'all getting wounded. But some of the ways y'all get banged up is wild.
If you think it's embarrassing, you talk to a guy that's been shot through the butt, and people say, well, where'd you get hit? And they'll always say in the hip. It wasn't in the hip. It was right through the ass is what happened. Well, can I see the scar? Gee whiz, no. Yeah, but it's real embarrassing. So they go out and if they get wounded, they try to get wounded someplace else, where you don't have to admit that. Yeah.
It's like, which direction were you facing?
Yeah, exactly. I had my doctor at Bethesda got one of his testicles shot off in Korea. The bullet just came right through and clipped it as neatly as you can possibly imagine. And there was a guy next to me in the hospital who was about to have surgery because he had stepped on a tomato can in Vietnam, AP mine, and it blew out part of the inside of his thighs, and he'd gotten damaged up in the genitals. And he didn't want surgery. He wasn't going to have it at all. Absolutely not. This is Bethesda in '67. And the doctor said, look, if you don't, I'm telling you, you're going to die. You're just not. He said, I don't give a damn. I'm not going to do it. And the guy said, well, what if I show you this? He drops trow right there on the ward. This guy's a equivalent of a lieutenant colonel in the Navy, a commander. There are nurses around. He drops trow. He's naked as a jaybird. And he says, how many of those little ghoulies down there do you count? The guy said, what do you have, just one? He said, yeah, I got the other one shot off in Korea. And look at me, I've got 3 children. The fellow said, Jesus, Pete, does it really work like that? And he said, man, all you need is one. And with that, he said, oh, okay. And the guy said, okay. And he made sure, he said, I want you to be my doctor. He said, I wouldn't miss it for the world. And so he went down there and took out what he needed to take out. And the guy won, and he left the hospital before I did. So, it all turned out well.
Wow, that is amazing. Thank God for doctors like that. I mean,
Dr. Harrington, yeah. He was my surgeon. He was a hell of a good guy. Very funny, as you can imagine.
Wow. Again, we've just hit the 3-hour mark, and what would you like to close with, sir? I've been asking you and covering all of this. What would you like to close out with for today?
I can do it in 30 seconds. I had those are some of the best years of my life because the people I worked with, utterly reliable, utterly dependable. They put their lives on the line for you in a second. And people talk about the camaraderie of the armed forces, and they think it's sort of a meme, and it does really exist. I mean, they are your brothers in there, and your guys are often closer to these guys that they were in the bush than they are to their wives or girlfriends. And it's it's another life. Some people talk about it after the war, some people don't, and you just have to respect that. But those are certainly years that are indelibly impressed in my mind because of the not only what you went through, but the guys you went through with it, and how good these people were to one another. So, and that's not just in the Marines. My dad was in the Army, and he had friends his whole life. It's that way with Rhodesia. Those guys are still meeting over there 40 years after the war. Any veterans organization has that. So it's a life that is, and you don't have to be in combat either. Peacetime is just as you get just as tight with guys. So it was another life, but it was certainly one worth living, I think.
Wow. That's a perfect way to end it. And guys, we will cover because we'll cover him leaving Vietnam and what the process entails of him getting into Rhodesia, and that'll cover some of the other stuff that I had that we didn't really get into. But we wanted to make this about Vietnam and his time with the Marines, Battalion, and Force. So I'm hoping from the numbers and all the comments, everyone has enjoyed it so far. People saying top notch, thank you, and I'll pass all of these on to you because they come in like wildfire here. But if you want to stay on, we'll close out in just a second, and we can see about maybe getting something on the books for part 2 for Rhodesia.
Sure,
but
sure, be happy
guys, we're gonna go ahead and close it out. We've hit the 3-hour mark. I will pass on all of the messages to Mr. John, Dr. Cronin, I should say, and we'll immediately let y'all know when we get Rhodesia on the books and scheduled for, so y'all can join us for that, because that is going to be absolutely outstanding. So you guys have a good day. We'll
Thank you all
be
for listening.
With you.
Really grateful for everybody joining Bud and me this afternoon, this morning. So thanks for taking the time out, ladies and gentlemen.
Absolutely. I'll end it on that. Mr. John, stay on. I'm closing out now. Guys, we'll see y'all later, and I'll be in touch with update on when we're going to do